All right, good morning, Revenue Committee. It's 8:30. Welcome to our third meeting. Quickly before we begin, I assume you all know there is a fourth meeting scheduled the Thursday and Friday of the third week of December next month. So the next 2 days, any last minute bill drafts that you want the committee to consider will need to be moved at this meeting for final discussion and vote at our next meeting. With that, Josh Anderson, I think you're on if you'd call the roll.
Senator Baldwin.
Excused.
Senator Beitman.
Here.
Senator Driscoll.
He'd be a stand-in for the committee, but he's certainly excused.
Senator Ellis.
Excused.
What in the world?
Representative Blackburn.
Here.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Payton-Selman.
Here.
Representative Hallinan.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Roscoe.
Excused.
Representative Sweeney.
Here.
Representative Western.
Here.
Co-Chairman Case.
Present.
And Co-Chairman Zwanitzer.
I am here, and if you would call the roll, I think Representative Roscoe just joined us.
Representative Roscoe.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, Ellis here.
We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman?
And you did get Senator Ellis, Josh?
I did, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. And if the record would also show, we have at least two of our incoming members, Representative Baker and Representative Yin, who are joining us. And I understand we may have several more of representative-elects and former representatives who are joining the Revenue Committee in the next biennium, joining us throughout the day. So with that committee, first up this morning, we have a report on the most recent CRAG, brought to you by our very own LSO. And I think Mr. Richards is on and screen sharing is available. So Dawn, good morning, and tell us how much better the picture is than it was 5 months ago.
Happy days are here again.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Don Richards. I am the Budget and Fiscal Administrator for the Legislative Service Office, and in my testimony this morning is I am appearing as the co-chairman of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. My report here is predominantly from the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, and by its name, it is not my own report, and it is far better than any individual product or LSO product could have been with the contributions from the executive branch and their experts. You'll recall that I presented to you on May 26th. And the theme of that report was humility, if you will recall. We had 1 month of data, and primarily that came from the month of March, which was essentially 3 weeks or perhaps 2 weeks of significant downturn in the economy. We had much better than expected summer and early fall, in particular oil prices, oil production, sales and use tax. And in the second half of calendar year 2000, we're seeing modest strength in coal as well as natural gas prices. Additionally, the governor's budget reduction cuts, which are obviously not forecast by CRAGs, also contributed to the benefit of the overall bottom line. Not only his step 2 reductions, which were the quote unquote first 10%, which were announced in August, but also the step 1 reductions, which was a vacancy freeze and overall contract review that he implemented in the spring of 2000. And then on Monday of this week, the governor announced his step 3 reductions, which provide additional reductions to state agencies, as well as some transfers of funds that he is recommending to the legislature. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will share my screen, and I hope to discuss 3 topics this morning, since the bill has, or the CRAG report has been out for about 3 weeks. You've all had a chance to read it. There have been numerous press accounts, and I have appeared before the Joint Appropriations Committee and given a more lengthy summary. I'll try to condense my comments to about 15 minutes and leave the balance of my time for any questions of the committee. Mr. Chairman, the first topic I hope you can see is my screen shows the goldenrod. In physical form, this would be printed on gold paper. And I have highlighted the first page, line 17, and it illustrates that the overall shortfall changed from May of $877 million to $451 million. And that is before the governor's reductions in August, which brought it down to $112 million rounded. In short, this improvement of $451 million or to $451 million from revenues and the reduction further to $112 million is approximately 50% improvement in revenue and 50% from the governor's step 2 and step 1 budget reductions. More precisely, and it's difficult to determine whether or not reversions should have been counted entirely as budget cuts, because we would expect some reversions to appear at the end of every biennium. But if you want to be more precise, our calculations suggest 52% was due to budget cuts and 48% was due to revenue improvements. And I'll get to the specific items, but this is just the overview. The second item I wanted to discuss is on page 4 of the profile, line 16. This is a little bit more difficult to identify in the profile, the improvements to K-12 school operations funding. It is embedded within the school foundation program account, and more specifically is tied to the statutorily guaranteed transfer from the rainy day fund, or the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, acronym being LSRA. You can see back in May in column H, there was a $515 million biennial shortfall projected. That has improved to about $309 or $310 million rounded. And then with the governor's cuts in August, improved to 308. I think after November's announcement earlier this week, I think this changed to about 308. You will see this was almost entirely due to improvements of revenue forecast and very little due to budget reductions, the difference between column J and column L. The governor is restrained in his potential activities to reduce the K-12 funding model in the absence of changes to legislation. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, the school capital construction account improved from a negative $26 million rounded in the May Craig report to a net positive $7 million as of the October Craig report. This account will be extraordinarily volatile. The only real revenue stream that is subject to movement in the positive or negative is this transfer of school lands mineral royalties account. And you can see it changed from 47.1 million to 71.6 million. What drives that is not only the price of Wyoming's extractive commodities, but also the location of those operations. So if a large coal mine moves west rather than north, north perhaps might go onto federal lands, west might go onto a state land parcel. You can see a large variation. Please take line 2 very cautiously because this will change from Craig report to Craig report fairly dramatically based upon the location of large extractive operations in the state of Wyoming. That's my conclusion to topic 1. And next I will jump to the Craig report, just one page. This is an excerpt from the October Craig report, table 3. And I just wanted to identify a handful of the primary drivers of the Craig report and their changes since the May Craig report. Crude oil being the largest change, and particularly production of crude oil. In May, we had forecast, of course, we had 1 month of data or maybe a half a month of data in terms of production in COVID, bringing you back to that May conversation. It was also a hybrid meeting between Lander and Cheyenne. I'm trying to draw the picture there. And you'll recall the month of April had prices that went negative in the WTI or West Texas Intermediate crude oil market, and pretty sustained prices in the single-digit dollars per barrel level for Wyoming producers. Given that we had widespread shut-ins across the state, and Craig at that time projected about a 40% decline in year-over-year oil production in the state of Wyoming. It did shut in about that amount, but producers turned the spigots back on very quickly. And October, we have revised that estimate to be an overall decline of 20%, still a staggering reduction of Wyoming oil production, but approximately 102 million barrels of production in calendar year 2019. And you will see at the top of this page, we are now projecting $80 million, which is a substantial increase to the May Craig report. We've also modified the prices in 2 calendar years. These 2 years, we increased those prices by $5 on each year. All of these out year numbers remain the same in terms of prices. That was a big change on this table, oil production. In addition, and this seems a little bit counterintuitive, I'll admit, our coal production, we actually reversed course, and we had projected a continued ramp down in declining coal production for Wyoming. And we have substituted that in calendar year 21, that's next calendar year, with a modest 15 million ton, approximately 7% increase. That is consistent with the EIA. That is also consistent with our projection of modestly higher natural gas prices. Coal becomes more competitive as the price of natural gas increases. And then finally, not on this table, but our sales and use tax forecast increased fairly dramatically by $81 million over the upcoming 21-22 biennium. The large drivers of that are several significant wind development projects, as well as a better understanding of both federal monetary and fiscal stimulus and its activities within the state of Wyoming. To give you a sense, external entities have estimated that $3.7 billion has been inserted into the state of Wyoming from direct federal fiscal stimulus, not counting all of the monetary stimulus. LSO's own tracking is right near that. We actually can identify $3.9 billion of federal stimulus. And that is certainly serving to bolster the sales and use tax collection, at least in the near term. Unfortunately, we also have a decline in our estimates of pooled income, and particularly that is lower yields, as well as lower projected corpus. So we have less money to invest and at lower rates. Finally, Mr. Chairman, my last slide here is a long-term profile. It's also listed on your list of items for this meeting in your meeting materials. I believe it's Appendix 2-03. This is a new format for the long-term revenue forecast. It includes the governor's Step 2 reductions. It does not include the November supplemental budget reductions at this time. This format was largely developed with a small working group of Senator Kinski, Senator Hicks, who were both instrumental in its development, and then a bit later on, Representative Schwartz from the Joint Appropriations Committee also contributed to this new format. What this does is it looks at not only the current biennium, but it goes out 2 successive bienniums for a total of 6 years. And I will jump to the kind of the bottom line. And while this line 36 does not include the most recent actions by the governor, our preliminary review is he has completely addressed the projected shortfall, as well as the statutory reserve or cash balance on the general fund side for the current biennium. And since this is a cumulative shortfall, It's a little bit difficult for us to tell until we fully synthesize the 2,000-page supplemental budget. But my guess is we're within $60 million or $30 million per year of a sustainable general fund budget. And when you talk about $60 million out of a $2.5 billion budget, our estimates will probably not be that close 6 years out. So the governor's budget appears to be long-term sustainable. Now, that's not to say that the approach that he took will not meet criticism or differences by various policymakers in terms of what he reduced, whether those reductions are sustainable, what he used to transfer or bolster that. But just looking purely at the bottom line, the cumulative surplus or shortfall is essentially balanced on the general fund budget reserve side. The same cannot be said on the school foundation program. And you will see on line 37 here that I'm highlighting, this is what has garnered a fair bit of attention from your colleagues on the Joint Appropriations Committee as well as statewide press. We still have that $307 million shortfall for the current biennium, which is unaddressed. I think he actually netted out 308, so his November changed that by maybe $1 million. And then this grows fairly substantially. This is not a cumulative number, but this is an additional $560 million next biennium and an additional $690 million the following biennium. This is what I have been presenting, not just in May, but for several years, that there is a structural imbalance on the K-12 funding side of the state's profile. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will cease my presentation, stop sharing my screen, and be happy to visit about specific components.
Any questions from the committee? Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Richards. And I just am trying to keep in front of me a chart, honestly, and a chart that has in it what the budget shortfall is without the governor's budget recommendations and with the budget recommendations for each of the upcoming bienniums. And so could you just kind of walk me through the figures that I would use without the governor's recommendation for 21-22, and we'll just talk general fund side at this point.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, the actual budget shortfall without governor's recommendation is $451 million on the general fund side. However, that does not include a cash balance. And for the last 30 years, your chambers have insisted upon a 5% cash balance. The purpose of this is in no month do you want to, go to a zero or heaven forbid, a negative cash balance in your own personal checking account. So that 5% statutory reserve amount would increase the net shortfall to the general fund to $564 million if you're willing to entertain not going to zero.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up before we kind of fill out the rest of the chart. Mr. Richards, I'm curious about that 5%. Is that a common figure that is used by other states? Is that just about right? Is it high or low from your experience?
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chairman, it is certainly a policy decision, and I will say that the legislature has insisted upon that, in my recollection, for all but 1 year, and they have fully funded that 5%. It is not a requirement on the legislature. You have left town with less than 5%. It is a requirement for the governor, and he did submit his budget recommendations with the 5% cash balance fully funded. Is that an appropriate amount? It has worked well in the past. I will say that. It is becoming a bit out of date, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, not the opinion of Craig. And the reason I say that is it's 5% of general fund revenue, and we're relying so heavily on the budget reserve account. I describe it as spouse one's checking account and spouse two's checking account. And so it's really 5% of about 1/2 of general operating revenue, which is about 2.5% of the total budget, which it used to be 5% of the total budget. So if anything, it's probably a little on the light side.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Richards, now could you fill out the rest of my chart for me?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly. In October, we had still left about a $225 million shortfall for the governor, but with his actions on Monday, he not only addresses that, now, people can disagree with how he addressed it, but he actually leaves $7 million to the good on the table, plus fully funds the statutory reserve amount. So he has, by Craig estimates, he has addressed fully the budget reductions on the general fund budget reserve.
Great. Now, could we move on to 23-24?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, the Craig estimate, including a fully funded SRA, would be $350 million shortfall with no reductions or cuts, $350 million. We have not looked at the governor's reductions out that far because we have to go through and identify what were one-time reductions and what were sustainable. But in my rough estimates, I have not read the full 2,000-page supplemental budget. But roughly I come within $60 million. And that's what I said in my testimony previously, at $60 million to the negative. It is not a $60 million surplus. And frankly, we're going to miss our Craig estimate 4 years out by more than that percentage. So all we need is a small uptick in or downturn in capital gains or oil. It is in the ballpark of being balanced long-term is the best way I would describe it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now can I ask about SFP?
Sure. Go ahead, Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, unfortunately, the SFP is going to be the same for both boxes. It's maybe $1 million difference depending on how you categorize the reductions to the school foundation program appropriations for state agencies. That is the National Guard Youth Challenge Program, the Department of Education, that sort of thing. So in both boxes, near term 21-22, we look at a shortfall of 308. Long term, let's call it 560. $1 million on both.
Thank you, Mr. Richards, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, committee, other questions from Mr. Richards? Senator Beitman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Richards, what is the annual baked in increase in spending in K-12? I've heard it's upwards of 7%, but I wanted to get an actual number from you, what the rate of spending is increasing every year on the K-12 side.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chairman, excellent question, and we have ratcheted that down. There's an argument that we should ratchet that down even further to have the embedded escalator to be a embedded de-escalator. But currently we have reduced our ADM enrollment assumptions to be flat. School districts around the state are reporting fairly significant declines in enrollment. However, we expect a lot of those students to be shifted to the Bighorn County and Niobrara school districts, which are providing online education statewide. So we have included a 0% ADM growth long-term. We've actually included a negative health insurance in our current assumptions. And we know that the Department of Administration and Information has reversed its proposed 10% increase on employer contribution to a 2.7% decrease beginning in January of 2021. However, after that, in future years, we return to our traditional assumption of a 10% annual increase just on the health insurance component. And then there are two other components we have embedded escalators on, or inflation projections, and that is a 4% growth for all reimbursements. Number one, special education, because we pay 100% of special ed. Those costs have historically grown by about 4% per year. And we also include a 4% growth on the reimbursement for transportation. Net, it is a very modest increase, low single digits, not anywhere near 7%. And we do not include any future ECA. And I know that's a point of contention, but we're not going to presuppose what our bosses will do on an ECA until you vote on one. So we're going to put in 0 until you tell us otherwise, collectively.
Music.
I don't think Representative Roscoe has a question. Representative Hallinan, question? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At some point, I don't know if now would be the appropriate time to ask Don about the Wyoming estimated tax capacity until we've had all the questions answered on the Craig and the forecast, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're halfway there, so you might as well throw it out now.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think it was, might have been 2 education committee meetings ago, Don, at the request of the committee, had put together a Wyoming estimated tax capacity, and that got distributed earlier this week in meeting materials. It's quite colorful. I don't know if I can, but I wondered if Don might address what the meaning of this is as far as taxation in general possibilities.
All right, so Mr. Richards, I assume you understand what Representative Sweeney is asking. For the rest of the committee, there was a presentation to the Joint Education Committee, I believe, about Wyoming's tax rates compared to other states surrounding us, their tax rates, and where those averages fall and what that could look like for Wyoming. So with that preface, Mr. Richards, take it away.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Revenue Committee, I will share my screen, which is a copy of that presentation. Second, hopefully you can see this. As Representative Sweeney noted, it has a number of colors on it. First and foremost, I don't want to take credit. The vast majority of the work actually came out from your committee staff. Dean Tempty did the lion's share of the analysis for this one-page assessment. And the request from the Joint Education Interim Committee was to look at all surrounding states plus North Dakota, given its similarities, on all major revenue streams and calculate the median tax rate in each of those states and compare it to the state of Wyoming's current rate, and then determine the difference between Wyoming's current rate and the median rates of those 7 states, and subsequently calculate the revenue increase that is likely to be generated if Wyoming imposed a tax rate at that median rate. This was challenged in some respects because we needed to develop a number of assumptions For example, individual income taxes, those surrounding states have a variety of methodologies of imposing that. Some of them are flat taxes, others are progressive taxes. So we used information that was available, and for that one, for example, we worked with the requester and identified a bill that had been offered in the state of Wyoming. So moving across the page, you can see the individual income tax rate. Wyoming has none. Our surrounding states have a median of 4.95, and we looked at what that rate would generate in the state of Wyoming if imposed. First of all, you can see it takes over a year to impose such a tax because we don't currently have one. And then we included all of the constitutional deductions or credits, credits, not deductions, as well as we included the base rate of, or the base amount of, I believe it's $300,000. So it would only apply to incomes greater than $300,000. We did that because there was recent legislation that set those parameters for us, so staff didn't have to generate the estimates. The corporate income tax did something very similar. You can see the sales and use tax. Great example here, the median rate is 6.86. Our average statewide rate is 5.34. That's inclusive of local sales and use taxes, just like the other states are inclusive of both statewide and local assessments. This does not mean that Wyoming's current rate is the lowest. So in this column, you see the state of Montana is actually at 0%, but we looked at the median of the 7 states and then increased Wyoming's tax rate by 1.52%. You can see this one would start immediately because it's relatively easy to impose and would generate about $230 to $250 million.
Mr. Richards, can I interrupt you real fast? Senator Case has a question. Go ahead, Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Richards, with respect to the sales tax, we've kind of been wrangling with that, of course. And one thing I think that is useful to point out is that our tax rates look similar, but if you actually look at the sales tax and its implications as to what it is imposed on, I think you'll find that in almost all those other states, the incidence of the tax is deeper in that it gets more goods and services than it does in Wyoming. So if we were to partner that change in the tax rate with getting rid of exemptions, for example, it would be even more powerful. In fact, if you look at South Dakota there, they raise a lot more revenue with tax rates that are somewhat equivalent to ours because of their lack of exemptions. You didn't take that into consideration, as I would understand it, but I think that's an important point in the sales tax issue, and also would allow for a quick implementation of a tax.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, you're exactly correct. We used the current basis and just increased the rate. We did not expand the base, nor did we adjust any of the exemptions. So farm machinery or data centers or food are all included in that. That is a bit more challenging of an exercise to identify what the median is of the base.
So committee, any other questions on that chart? I can have Don put it back up if anybody wants to look at it further. I do think it was a good exercise the Education Committee did, and at least comparing where we are. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just kind of on that point, as a member of the Education Committee, I know we talked and looked at that chart, but we never took a vote as the committee to have it developed. So Mr. Richards did mention that there was someone who requested that it be developed, and I was just curious, or just maybe make the point that, to my recollection, it wasn't Joint Ed that asked for it, but that another member had requested it. Is that right, Mr. Richards?
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, that is correct. The inquiry came from Representative Obermiller. It was made during a joint education committee, and we certainly worked with primarily Representative Obermiller in identifying, for example, whether to include North Dakota or not. And then even further, although we didn't discuss this, the property taxes is even more complicated because the average of states is not clear, because you can imagine every municipality, every county is a little bit different. And across 7 states, we used a specific methodology which identified one selected rural community and the largest urban center in each of the 7 states.
Representative Sweeney, follow up? Then I'll get sent.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to that point, I just, when I saw this, I think it's a very useful tool on what our surrounding states kind of sort of look like, because there are so many variables. So, and that whether it came out of our committee or education or the request, I think it's a valuable thing for us to look at in our discussions in general today and where the state is at. And I'm not advocating that we stop looking at cuts. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying I think it's a valuable tool, and I appreciate Don's and Dean's work on this because I think it is a very, very good tool. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wouldn't you agree with that, Mr. Richards? It's a good tool. I think was a question for you.
Mr. Chairman, I have no comment.
Okay. Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's a good tool. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Richard, can we post that on the website and make it a public document so that folks can look at it? Has that already been done, or can we do that and so that we can all be part of the committee materials?
Mr. Richards, if you know.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we have done so. It is part of your appendix. I believe it's attachment 2-04, and Katie can correct me if I misstated that.
And just some housekeeping, Mr. Chairman. You know, last week in the Corporations Committee, there were things that were shared on the screen but weren't made part of the kind of the committee package. And so people felt very disadvantaged, people in the public. And it's part of our difficulty in transitioning from in-person meetings where you can hand the things out to making sure just putting them on the screen is not enough for the public watching, and they have to be able to really get a hold of it themselves. And we learned that the hard way last week in Corporations.
Okay. I'm glad Mr. Richards and Ms. Talbot are on top of it. Any other questions from Mr. Richards' committee? Let me throw just one that I know the answer to, but for people watching, Don, the most recent recommendation of cuts of roughly $500 million to balance the budget from the executive branch, none of those reductions have actually been put into effect yet, or have any of them to your knowledge. And as the executive branch said, based on the ultimate budget, when that additional 500 million cuts on top of the 400 million from 3 months ago might go into effect, should we not reverse those.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, first and foremost, I would defer to Kevin, who is up next. It's my understanding that all of the August budget reductions, which amount to approximately $335 million, have been initiated by all agencies as of July 1. The accounting for all of that, I believe, is still in process with the state auditor's office. But those cuts were effective as of July 1. The November cuts, or the additional, I'll call it $115 million, and Kevin can give a more precise number. Those cuts are largely scheduled to commence on July 1, 2021, after review and revision, if there is any, by your bodies.
Okay. Representative Sweeney, question?
So just to be clear, roughly 330 to 350 in the first round, and then 120 to 150 roughly in step 3, bringing it to the total of roughly 500 million. Is that appropriate? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, again, I would defer to Kevin on the way he wants to characterize it, but in my mind, it's actually $60 million from step 1, which is often forgot about. These were implemented immediately last spring through vacancy freezes, through review of contracts, and it absolutely changed the cash flow for the state by implementing those early. And then the 335, and that 335 is inclusive of reductions by your branch, the legislative branch, as well as the judicial branch. So they weren't entirely of the governor's executive branch, but the vast majority are in the executive branch. And then the remainder, I think the way I look at it is about $115 million of cuts. And there were some transfers. For instance, major maintenance is being transferred out of the general fund. It's not entirely being cut. So those are the components I see to it. And I would also mention that not all agencies have been as aggressive in their timing. So last week, or maybe it was this week, you've probably seen the University of Wyoming trustees finally implemented their budget reduction plan. However, those cuts are started on July 1, meaning they're July 1 of 2020. Those funds were removed from the University of Wyoming's block grant, and it just becomes more difficult to make those reductions over 21 months rather than 24 months. But it's not as if those entities who were, I'll call it, more delayed in the implementation got a pass. It's still the same amount of money as of July 1.
Okay. All right, any further questions from Mr. Richards? Otherwise, I will get him off the hot seat. Thank you, Mr. Richards, for joining us this morning and updating us on the Craig. With that, we will go over to the executive branch and our state budget director, Mr. Hibbard. Welcome to Revenue. I know it's been a rough couple of weeks for you over there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's been a rough couple of 6 months for all of us on this process. And I am Kevin Hibbard. I'm the director of the state budget department, and I will be showing you today the profile. Now, Katie, you can pull it up, or if you want me to share it, I can share it.
Sure, I think you're allowed to share your screen.
You should be seeing the profile. On the very top, it says Governor's Recommendation Fiscal Profile.
Yep.
Thank you. I really do appreciate Don. Don's comments really made my comments simple, because what I'll be doing today is just basically showing you where Don's comments tie together to the overall picture of where we are today. So first of all, in accordance to the goldenrod or the LSO spreadsheet, we were at a negative 451 after the October Craig, 877 after the May Craig, and Don's correct. Humility, it was the flavor of the day for the May Craig. So that $451 million does benefit from $67 million of reversions that took place during step 1. If you remember, the governor had instituted a position freeze and a contract freeze, and that contract freeze and position freeze led us to higher amounts of reversions. My original estimate for reversions without FMAP was 40 million. We came in with reversions after FMAP about 47. So all the agencies really did help us out in that, and that $67 million is in or added to that 451 to get us there. And I'll be talking a little bit more about the statutory reserve as we get there, but let's just start here. And it's strange, I know, in accounting practices to look at this starting off this way, but we're going to start off as the $451 million. That's the negative amount that we were challenged with after the October Craig. So to just reiterate Don's comments, if you go down further a little bit, you'll see step 2 budget reductions. That's the $254,551,202, and those were implemented July 1st. Along with that was the $32,212,897 step 2 major maintenance reductions. This was a cut. We went from overall 2% on major maintenance to 1.5% on major maintenance. So we did cut $32 million. And that's basically the step 2, $335 million that Don was referring to. We also moved in step 2, we transferred from major maintenance general funds to SIPA at 48.3, and that's in the supplemental request. The governor cannot do that. He can recommend that, which he has, but the legislature would have to act upon that. So that rolls us up through step 1 and through step 2. Then what you do is you get into step 3. Step 3, we got $115 million of additional cuts, which Don spoke about. We also have an additional transfer from general funds to SIPA for $48.3 million. And I think in anticipation of a question, why would you transfer major maintenance to SIPA? Well, I think we want to keep the buildings we have in good repair rather than spending money on building new monies at this point in time in the situation that we are in with lack of revenue for COVID. Next, we had $827 million of one-time furlough. Then we had the judicial branch, which is $2.1 million of reductions in step 2. Legislative branch, $2.3 million in step 2. And then finally, post-Craig reversions. The budget has the opportunity to work all the way up until November 16th. LSO, Craig, Chairman, myself, and Don Richards, we posted the known reversions then, but we have collected another $2 million of reversions since the Craig was posted, and we've added it to our profile. You heard the governor talk about $500 million in reductions. If you take the courts and the LSO off the 505, 441, 405, there's your $500 million. Now I want to slow down just a little bit, and I'm going to say this next line, which is step 3, adjusted for July 1st, 2021 implementation. I'm going to try to say this at least 3 separate ways so we're clear on what that means. What that means is in step 3, the governor is making a recommendation that we implement step 3 reductions on the second half of the biennium, or starting July 1st, 2021. The question be why? Well, there's a significant amount of legislation that's required for recommendations that agencies have made for reductions that would have to be addressed if you are so inclined to choose those reductions. And again, and there's some, as we progress from step 1, freezes, step 2 to what we had to do for cash flow, and then step 3, each incrementally level that we went to, it became more and more problematic for not only the states to operate their programs, but more importantly, the impacts to constituents. So those impacts are going to be put in step 3 in front of the legislature. You'll work those, and then at the end of the session, we'll know what that amount of money is. Because what we're recommending for step 3, again, is to implement step 3 in the second half of the biennium. Therefore, the legislature gets to work those reductions during the upcoming session. What does that $51.6 million mean? Well, we built the budget on a biennial basis with LSO, and we wanted to do it that way. In the past, we would do something a little bit different. We would just, show the actual cuts, and then we'd have this problem when we went into the next biennium that nobody knew what the next biennium's impacts were. Don couldn't do long-range plan. You heard Don talk about the one-times and et cetera. Very complicated process. So up front, what the governor's recommendation is. It's on a biennial basis for step 3. We're adjusting that biennial basis back 1 year for those things that are not one time, and that's $51.6 million. That's the adjustment for us to implement step 3 for second half of the biennium. Then we do have the 1% severance tax. You'll see the 123.8. The governor's making that recommendation to use that, and you'll see a footnote as contingent on legislative appropriation of 1% severance tax. And also the next line, you'll see the 5% general fund statutory reserve of 113,185. That conversation took place a little bit. Don was talking about the fact that the 5% is only predicated on the general fund revenue, not the budget reserve revenue. But what it also does is it takes the ability from the governor to be able to add it to his profile and not have it for balancing the budget. In this case, if you were to double that, like Don was suggesting for the budget reserve, then there would be less money for the governor to use for the profile, but more money perhaps for the legislature to decide whether or not they wanted to implement the 5% statutory reserve or not. But historically, we always have, with the exception of 2016, we did not because we were challenged then as well. So there has been in the past where we haven't implemented the full amount of statutory reserve. I believe in the 16 we didn't have a recommendation for that, but this one we do. So we have a balanced budget. So what that means is that we have $13.3 million in the governor's profile, as we discussed, to on the bottom line. And the bottom line, what takes place with the bottom line is it automatically goes to the LISRA, and you can see on the bottom of the page the amount of money that's going into the LISRA. It's the negative here coming out of the general fund and coming back into the LISRA, which helps us. You've heard Don discuss the $308 million. This is how it currently works with the governor's profile for the school foundation program, which is in the upper right quadrant of the report, the 308. That'll actually improve a little bit because, again, we'll have the clawback or the fact that we're implementing these reductions in the second half of the biennium. So if the youth challenge program is eliminated, you get another $1.7 million. And if the legislature does not decide to continue to fund the preschool DD with school foundation program, we'll get another 2.1, so about $4 million worth of improvement on the one-time basis, predicated on the legislative activity on those categories. The other thing that was important in LISRA that I want to point out is the governor has made a recommendation of 10.5 or a 10% reduction in $105 million that goes to local governments, which is funded out of the LISRA. So before I go on to the next page, I'll just continue to talk about this page. I'll go to the right. You can see the school foundation program, and Don's pretty well laid that out for everybody. I think the most important thing is what's the transfer out of the LISRA for the school foundation program. That's that $308.5 million. And then you can see the transactions associated where the legislature appropriated and where the governor's made changes. Not a whole lot of work, but there are some. And in particular, there's the Youth Challenge Academy, the $3 million that ETS is giving up for the unified network, and also the $2.1 million for the DD step 3. Then you got school capital construction, very simple conversation, funded at the legislative appropriated level. When you left last spring, we pushed the brakes a little bit on this in the summer because we were short in the SCCA. So we didn't act upon that. We just kind of said, hey, we're going to pump the brakes. But all the projects that the legislature appropriated during the session have been are now approved in the governor's recommendation for the budget. And then there's the $7 million remaining amount that Don talked about. And we're just transferring that back over the SIPA because the SIPA transfers in and out to balance the SCCA of the school capital construction. And lastly, I want to show you the SIPA, what takes place. You'll see the LSO profile. You'll see the $48 million that the legislature appropriated. Then you'll see the step 2, 48 transfer. Then you'll see the state step 3, $48 million transfer. You'll see $580,000 for a 1-year amount for the Casper facility. I want everybody to understand that once the Casper facility gets set up, we'll get it in the statewide cost allocation, and ultimately they'll get billed to those agencies that belong in that building. And if those agencies are supported by special revenue or federal revenue, we'll capture that money. But there's a 2-year look back on the statewide cost allocation. So we're asking for SIPA to operate the Casper building until we get it, the counting completed. State capital construction, you'll see in this document, because where I'm going, and Senator Case spoke to it, is where can the people of Wyoming find these documents. All I am right now is in the compendium that's posted out on the state budget department's website. You can just go to Wyoming budget and you go to supplemental budget and you'll see this document. This profile is simply in this document. And also in this document, the tail end is the CapCon bill. So you can look at the CapCon, and you can also look at all of the exception requests for step 2, step 3, the narratives that represent the consequences of all those actions. and ultimately get a flavor for everything that's included in what we have rolled up here today in the profile. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thanks. If you would stop sharing your screen, it makes it so much easier for me to see everyone. But let me throw one question at you. The step 2 reductions have been implemented, and I can't remember what it was, 25 employees got RIFed, but for the step 3, those won't be implemented up until next July at present, if we go on this course and appropriations and the legislature approves these reductions. How many total positions just are we talking that will be eliminated, not counting education?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's going to be 380 positions eliminated, both step 2 and step 3.
And
I think it's important.
Filled positions?
Mr. Chairman, of those, we had 26 that were RIFed in step 2, and we have 62 that are RIFed in step 3, predicated on legislative action. Remember, legislative action is required on step 3.
Okay. And that doesn't count anything on the education side of the K-12 reductions that may impact teachers or principals or administrators, et cetera, correct?
Mr. Chairman, it does not include K-12 or higher education.
UW. Okay. Committee questions for Mr. Hibbard. Representative Connolly. You're still on mute.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I've got two very different questions. One is understanding and then one is substantive. My just understanding question, Mr. Hibbard, I need to go back to that page 1, step 3 adjustment, that $51.6 million. Could you explain again, what's the relationship between that $51.6 million for July 1st, 2021 implementation and the $114.7 million that we see with the step 3 budget reductions? I'm still not getting the relationship between those two numbers.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, I'd be pleased to answer that. That is a complicated scenario. I'm going to answer it in a couple different ways again. In 23-24, that $51.6 million will be cut. It's an adjustment for this biennium, for the second half of this biennium. So in step 3, the governor cut $114.6 million. In order to time that, so where we had the funding that was necessary for the second half of this biennium, it was necessary for us to keep $51.6 million. But when this biennium's finished, that $51.6 million will benefit the 23-24 budget to that full $51.6 million. It's simply the amount of money that we're using to fund those step 3 reductions until such time as the biennium is over, or for the second half of the biennium.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, follow up on that one. Thank you. Is that $51.6 million just a general pot, or is it directed towards very specific savings for the next biennium?
The implementation, Mr. Chairman, of all the reductions to have them be on the second half of the biennium, with the exception of those that were one-time in nature where we took 100%. So whatever we needed to implement the ongoing portion of the second half of the biennium, we needed $51.6 million.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I move to my second question?
That wasn't your second and third questions, Representative Connolly?
That was question 1, part A, B, and C.
All right, question 2.
All right, Mr. Hibbard, this is going to sound like killing the messenger, but you are the messenger. All right, and I'd like, it's one thing to talk about the numbers and to actually kind of look at and understand the numbers, and I appreciate that and the good summary that we have here with the fiscal profile. But honestly, what I want to know is what's the content of some of the cuts? And in particular, I'll ask about the Department of Health and the Department of Family Services. We are talking about an enormous cut to those budgets. And so I'd like to know what's being cut, what services are no longer going to be available to people in the state, and honestly, the harm that we anticipate because of those cuts.
Mr. Hibbard, good luck.
Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate that question. It's it's a tough place for all of us to be in. But my answer to that is I'm not prepared to go into detail on all the reductions. I think it would take quite a bit of time. But I would like to make sure that the audience knows and the Joint Revenue Committee knows that they can go into the supplemental budget. And if you go to our compendium, or if you go to the LSO's compendium, our compendium, you can click on an agency on the very title page, and it'll take you to that agency. Then you can go to the agency's priority table, and that priority table will tell you what they're reducing. And then you can go to those priorities, and you can see inside of the narrative, inside the budget book, the consequences associated with these reductions. One of the communiques that we received from the Joint Appropriations Committee through the summer was, please assist us with identifying the consequences. And I think this centers on Representative Connolly's question that, where do I go to find the consequences? The consequences are in those narratives associated with each one of those agencies' budget books.
Follow up, something more specific, Representative Connolly?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Hibbert. And as folks know, I mean, even the budget summary is 2,000 pages long. And so that's where you're just going to get the lines, and then you need to go even further. So let me ask kind of very particularly about a couple of them. And so that we start to understand what will happen to the funding for developmental disabilities, what will happen to funding for senior centers, what will happen to funding for suicide prevention, just 3 of them.
If you know off the top of your head, Mr. Hibbert.
Mr. Chairman, there's a couple of different ways to go about this. Like I said, I wasn't prepared to go into detail. Developmental disabilities, we're cutting step 2. We clawed it back for 1 year for the legislature to review that, and that's the school foundation program money that we have in on the profile. I would like to make sure that everybody understands that there's a navigable portion of this budget that we believe is very important to the audience and all the committees on the Joint Appropriations Committee. If you go to the Wyoming budget website and you go to the supplemental budget, it's not about going through 2,000 pages. What it is about going to the table of contents and clicking on that agency's link inside that table of contents to take you directly to that budget book that you want to see. So for example, I can click on 048 and it takes me to the budget 048. And the very first thing that you see in the very first pages are the step 2 and the step 3 reductions. And then throughout the remainder of that budget, you can go to those narratives and you can see the department's explanation of what the impacts of these reductions are. That's why we built it the way we wanted to make it user-friendly and interactive, and it is. So if you'd like to have assistance with getting through that process, please pick up the telephone. I'd be happy to do it. But it is interactive, and I think it's helpful to address Representative Connolly's questions.
And I think it's fair to say, and perhaps this is where Representative Connolly is going, that not only are we eliminating perhaps up to 100 state jobs, but the cuts that we're doing to DFS, Department of Health, Youth Challenge, I guess those are state jobs, but at least in health and family services, have significant cost reductions, which will affect other Wyomingites' employment throughout almost every community, if not every county, certainly in the state. I'm not sure that's easy to put a number on, but would you agree that the job loss will be significantly more than 100 based on the reductions that we will be doing in many of our social service programs?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. The statistic that we use is for every state job, you lose 1.6 private sector jobs. But I do want to make sure that the audience understands that we did not do across the board cuts. We did strategic cuts. You heard the governor speak to that. But one of the things in the strategic cut nature of this was special revenue or federal funds. If we cut matching in a program that the general funds matched and it was a 75% match or 50% match in federal funds, we had to look at the overall impact of the economy, because cutting simply the state portion and losing the federal portion really kind of, in basic terms, added insult to injury. So we were very strategic about how we approach this. But then again, we know that we have targets that we have to get, and we reach those targets.
Let me throw one more at you while Representative Connolly is finding the right question. So in the budget, an executive branch presenting the budget to the legislature, the governor can't advocate for tax increases to offset these cuts, but it appears he can advocate for spending like the severance, the 1% severance to be used. Would that be correct? And what's the difference? He can't advocate for a tax increase, but he can advocate for us to transfer money and in certain spending pots, and that's allowed under the statutes?
Mr. Chairman, I do have a footnote on there contingent upon legislative action for the 1% severance tax. The difference between the 1% severance tax and a new tax is the 1% severance tax exists. It's there for the legislature. The governor can put a note in there that says, use this, but it's contingent upon appropriation from the legislature. A new revenue is not in here.
So it technically could be $120 million worse if the legislature chooses not to utilize that fund where the governor is encouraging us to.
Yeah, and in combination, they could balance that with the 5%, $113 million for the statutory reserve. Those are in your hands to balance the budget. So basically, if you look at this on a biennial basis, when we go into 23-24, we have an additional $69 million, $70 million on the table. So we went past the target, but there are the two provisions. One is the 5% statutory reserve and the other is the 1% severance tax. And both, by the way, the precedent was established in the Meade administration that both of those were used in 2016.
Appreciate that. All right, Representative Connolly, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just actually a follow-up to your kinds of questions. Mr. Hibbard, would you agree that the consequences of these cuts are deep and that they are longstanding and that they will cause a negative impact to our community, to our citizens and our communities?
Mr. Hibbard, in your opinion, would you agree?
Mr. Chairman, one of the words that phrases that I chose to use when I was having a conversation with the Joint Appropriations Committee was this process has been painful. And maybe that's not good words to use, but please understand that we do know that balancing the budget has these consequences. And it's been very difficult for everybody on the executive branch side. It's been difficult for the agencies, agencies directors, the state budget department, the governor, and the policy office. These are not easy choices to make.
Mr. Chairman, just one more and then I'll stop. Okay. Mr. Hibbard, would you agree that several years ago when we did budget cuts, the penny plan, things like that, we cut specific programs? I'm thinking of one out of the Department of Corrections, for example, that immediately resulted in an increase in recidivism. That there are negative consequences to programs that have worked and have been vetted in this state that we're going to pay for down the line unless we maintain them, if not increase them. And that, in fact, I'll ask that as part A, and in part B, that our other obligation is to figure out how to fund them.
Mr. Chairman?
Agree.
Those are very poignant questions. And I think it lands in the place where we were on step 3. While we understand that there's multiple areas where the legislation would have to be changed in order to implement step 3, we also understand that as we progress deeper and deeper into this conversation of reductions, it becomes more and more important to get more involvement from everybody, including the legislature. And so that's one of the motivating factors that step 3 will be placed on the legislative agenda for you guys to work in the budget process.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Mr. Hibbard while we have him? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Kevin, this is unfortunately tremendous work. So, but I agree with Representative Connolly's comments, and but I am appreciative of all of this. My question goes to, I've noticed in comments and in the letter or budget message from the governor, some references to getting down to a single or two checkbooks versus all the coffee cans. And so in your view, what does that take from the legislature to try to implement all of that, all of those things, and kind of the vision that the budget office has for that?
Mr. Hibbert.
Mr. Chairman, there's been bills sponsored by the legislature to make the accounting, the checkbook, the savings accounts simpler. There have been conversations about closing the budget reserve and having that just in the general fund, et cetera. In this message from the governor, particularly the SIPA is what he'd like to see closed, and then an ongoing effort from everybody to see if we can't simplify everything that we do because it is complicated.
This is the Wi-Fi password here.
Okay, further
23
questions?
Sublet, Wyoming.
Turn on for Mr. Hibbert.
Timothy.
You're on mute, Mr. Chairman.
You can hear me now? Yep.
Yes, thank you. Not now.
All right.
There we go. All right. You can hear me now.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Just saying thank you for all your work. I know the last 6 months have been painful on all of us, and it can't be easy going line by line, talking to people who are affected. I know I've talked to several agency directors, and this is a killer exercise on eliminating people and programs. And I guess the legislature will take it from here to see what we can do to assuage the pain if possible. With that, enjoy your morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, for the next kind of 2 hours, we're going to go over things from the Management Council's directive to make sure we've covered tobacco taxes, alcohol taxation, and fuel tax. So I'll try to do those as a group. So maybe for the next 10 minutes, we can all take a break, reconvene here at 9:55. And so with that, we'll be in recess till 9:55. I remind you to mute your audio and turn off your camera. See you soon. All right, committee, we're going to reconvene. Let's make sure I've got everybody in the room who currently needs to be here. Welcome Director Noble from Department of Revenue, Treasurer Shell from Converse County. And up next today, we're going to have an update on our monthly ad valorem tax implementation. And I think officially Mr. Shell is up first on the agenda. So if that's okay, Joel, I'll let you take it away and let us know how negotiations and relations with industry and governmental counterparts are all working out currently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being here. I'm Joel Shell, the treasurer in Converse County, and thanks for allowing the treasurers to come give you an update on the implementation of House Bill 159. Of course, after that bill passed, there was a lot of discussion about what it meant and how to interpret it. So the counties, of course, at first we did nothing because our interpretation was that the state had been given the authority to bill mineral taxes. And then in the spring, we met with Director Noble, who advised us that he had quite a different interpretation of the bill. So we convened a meeting with a group of county attorneys that agreed to study it and help us work out how exactly to move forward. So we came to consensus on several issues then. One was that certainly the counties were responsible to bill the property taxes for 2020, which of course is the 2019 mineral production. So we began working with our software providers and the assessors to do that. Of course, our challenge is that right now we have systems that are designed to bill and collect property taxes in two halves, in a November payment and a May payment. And we needed to redesign that system to collect in 5 payments. This year be October, November for 25% each. And then the second half is broken into 16.67% payments in April, May, and June. And then, of course, depending on who collects the tax in the future, have a system that could collect maybe next year 7 payments or 9 or 11 moving out into the future. So it was quite an endeavor to adapt our systems that way. This was an endeavor that affected 22 of the 23 counties, since that's how many have some sort of mineral production in their county, whether it's sand and gravel or oil or coal or whatever they have. So we were successful in doing that. Our software providers were great. The assessors were great. Of course, the main challenge there was to try to separate out the billing process from our normal bills that would be billed on the existing tax bill, which is just 2 payments and 2 coupons, and be able to have a separate run that maybe we did in-house to print the mineral bills, which would now be on 5 payments. But we were successful doing that. And in September, the county treasurers statewide sent out over 400,000 tax notices. And about 1,200 of those were mineral notices sent out on the new bills. So the results, as we can see now, about 5% statewide of the mineral companies availed themselves to that October payment. And now we've seen in November, they're about the other 95% that have paid that first half, just paid historically the way they always have. So they made the 50% payment in November and did not make an October payment. Of course, they can do that without penalty because the interest dates haven't changed. So even as we move forward into the next half where we have an April, May, and a June payment, according to the transitionary schedule, if a company just makes the May payment 50%, they could do that without interest. So we expect probably to see that trend continue going forward. As far as where we go from here, of course, there's still a lot of discussion or a lot of disagreement about maybe how the House Bill 159 implementation affects billing in the future. I met with Director Noble and we came up with a couple of alternatives and some ideas that involve how we would transition from the counties collecting the tax to the state collecting it, as well as some proposals about changing the transitionary language or the timing to make it more easy to implement. But certainly a lot of that, what happens in the future will be up to the guidance we get out of the Attorney General's office and how they interpret that statute moving forward. So, Mr. Chairman, that's my update from the treasurers, and I would stand for any questions you have.
Okay, any questions from the committee for Mr. Shell at this time?
Mr. Chairman.
Let me get Senator Case and we'll go to Senator Else. Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Assessor. I'm a little bit, I guess I need to start video. I'm sorry. Sorry, now you can see me. I am a little concerned about what is happening. I've got, one of my concerns is, it is true that this year there aren't any extra payments, but the reason for going to monthly is to accommodate the extra payments that begin to kick in next year. And I feel that I think the counties have kind of defeated the purpose by having, in essence, you have 2 payments scheduled, but you say it doesn't really matter. We'll just collect one. And I also understand the notices went out for some counties quite late. You actually received your notice with your October and payment due. You received it with the October and November, and it came late in October. So I'm not really that happy with how it has gone down so far. And I think if we're going to get people on monthly schedules, we can't say, well, it's not really a monthly schedule. It's actually just like it used to be and still collect like it used to be. So I do have some disappointment. I wonder if you could address that.
Mr. Shell.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Case, I certainly can. So in terms of it's not the treasurer's position that the payments don't matter. We certainly put a lot of work into ensuring that we could collect in 5 payments. And the bills we sent had language indicating clearly that the companies had 5 payments due. So we altered our system so that we could then collect and distribute that money as made in 5 payments. Now, the bottom line is the taxpayers did not make the payment. Why? Well, there's no incentive to make it, right? So they also have systems that are designed maybe just to pay in 2 payments. And so it's certainly easier for them to continue doing what they've always historically done rather than altering what they're doing now. Since the statutory interest does not kick in until November 10th, they had the option of making that October 10th payment, but if they did not and just paid 50% in November, there was no difference to them. So that's on the statute side. We would certainly like, now that we've put in all this work to make a payment system work, we'd like some incentive for the taxpayer to follow that payment system, but there isn't one now. As to the lateness of the bills, I know of 2 counties specifically that had issues with vendors transitioning to the systems that caused some delay in the payments, as well as other delays caused by COVID and workforce situations, a lot of other issues that treasurers and counties are dealing with as we were trying to implement this. For the vast majority, though, the bills went out on time. We did have inquiries from several taxpayers, some of which were just confused about the whole thing. I mean, one of the sources of confusion is, of course, the Section 3 language in House Bill 159 is not codified, right? So if you are a new taxpayer to Wyoming and you're a comptroller and you pick up the statute to see what you should be doing, by every indication, you should be paying the state monthly payments. If you want to know what we're actually doing in this transition, you have to track down a copy of House Bill 159 and read that Section 3 language to sort out what's actually going on. So it's causing a lot of confusion. But Mr. Chairman, I can assure you, we made every effort to collect the payments in the 5 payments as designed by the statute. And we took our responsibility there very seriously.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Shell. And I'm wondering how we can best move forward. It seems like a bill draft for our December meeting that clarifies the penalties and makes the penalties coterminous with the right period of time from the due point would be appropriate. Also, we might want to codify the uncodified section of the law in response to your concerns. I think that's an excellent point. And then I think we'll wait till after the Department of Revenue and we can talk about the whether we need to do any changes to be more explicit as to what the notwithstanding in Section 3 refers to, whether it's all of Section 1 or just the part of the Section 1 about the monthly payments. So, stay tuned. I want to work with you and all the assessors, and I appreciate the work that's gone in. I know it's tough, but I think we're going to be in a better place. I'm just worried that if we don't put the emphasis on monthly, when it comes to time to collect the extra payment and begin the transition, it won't be as smooth. So work with me. Thank you.
Shell, if you have comments now, I'm sure we're going to hear from Director Noble as well and maybe have a broader discussion.
Can we hear from him right now, just a little bit?
Oh, sure. We'll hear from you right now, Mr. Shell. Thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I would defer that to Director Noble. I think he can lead the conversation from here.
All right, Senator Ellis, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've alerted to Treasurer Shell about needing some guidance from the Attorney General on some of this interpretation of the bill. I'm wondering if you could put a finer point on that for me. I had a lot of concerns in how rushed we pushed that legislation through this last session. There were a lot of issues I don't think we thought through fully. And so when you say that the counties or maybe through the Department of Revenue have had to ask the Attorney General to clarify. I'd like to know kind of the breadth of the questions that were asked, if you plan on sharing that with us, so that when we, are asked to look at potential amendments to that bill, we get the full legal background for it. So if you could let me know, put a finer point on that for me, please, Mr. Shell.
Mr. Shell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis. Yes, so Section 1 of the bill sets out an entirely different methodology to collect the tax, as well as a way of calculating it. So it says the state collects it, it's calculated by the taxpayer using a specific method. There's a true up, and there's a bunch of other language in there that involves then the state would be responsible to file liens on behalf of the county. It gives the counties the ability to make separate agreements with companies as far as whether they stay with the old payment system or the new. So as well as setting out what the new payment schedule is. So then Section 3 says at the beginning of it that notwithstanding Section 1, the payment schedule is modified as hereafter in this language. The question is, does then the rest of that language just modify the schedule, which is the county's position, which means all the other language is intact, right? So the state still collects it. The state is in charge of liens. The state is just doing it pursuant to that schedule, or does the Section 3 actually supersede all of the methodology in Section 1 and then and still result in the payments coming directly to the counties? And if that happens, then how much of that language in Section 1 is superseded? Is it just the schedule, or does it include, look, I guess the Treasurer's main problem with it, or concern, is that we may not have the authority to bill the tax. So if I send a tax bill to a taxpayer using the methodology we're currently using to calculate the tax, and they believe that they use the methodology in Section 1 and have a different result, then whose result is correct? And even right now, if we're filing tax liens on companies, and yet the current statute or Section 1 language says that the department has to file those on our behalf, then are those liens valid or not? And those are all questions, as well as the language that allows us to make separate agreements with separate companies. If we take out all of the Section 1 language and just look at Section 3, then we don't have that ability to make those agreements anymore, because that language is all in Section 1. And we have existing law that's not changed by those sections that went ahead and went in. For example, now every mineral section says that up until January of 2020, the taxes are due at the Treasurer's office, which certainly implies that after that, they're due somewhere else. But if we're not paying the state, then where are they due? So those are all the questions from the county side that we asked Director Noble to include in his request to the AG.
Good enough, Senator Ellis? Okay. Other questions for Mr. Shell at this time? He's not going to go very far. All right. With that, Mr. Noble, would you have comments on how it's going from the state's perspective?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Dan Noble, Director of the Department of Revenue. Thanks for allowing us to be here today to talk about this issue. I would say this: I don't believe that I can add much to what Joel has already said. I mean, there has been a great deal of confusion about who should be collecting this tax and when it would start with the Department of Revenue versus, or the state versus the counties. Obviously, when you're talking about Section 1, it talks about the monthly payment of ad valorem taxes. Well, if you look at Section 3, which basically excludes Section 1 by saying notwithstanding Section 1, it isn't monthly payment of ad valorem tax. It is payment on a different schedule. And it doesn't really, and I think that's one of the reasons the Attorney General looked at it and said, I don't think this involves you guys at this point, because of the fact that it is not a monthly payment of ad valorem, and that notwithstanding Section 1, which is what it says, this applies. And it creates a huge amount of confusion. And I think it's year 4 or year 5, when you actually start moving towards the actual payment of a monthly payment of ad valorem taxes, and you start catching up. I think it's almost 16 years that it takes to catch up to when you're actually on a monthly payment schedule with both your ad valorem tax as well as the severance tax on the same schedule. It moves it in that direction over a 16-year, and I refer to it as a payment plan, basically making up 1 month or 1/8 of the, 8% of that payment until the two align. And that's, I believe, in year 2040 almost is when this actually happens. And my thought was, and this is, Treasurer Shell and I had talked about this, is that, if you're really talking about the monthly payment of ad valorem taxes, maybe the idea would be to kind of deal with what was originally contemplated, and that is that the Department of Revenue would begin collecting both the ad valorem tax and the mineral severance tax on a monthly basis on the same report, but it would be for current production, and put all of the taxpayers on a 16-year payment arrangement, where 1/8 of the previous year's production would be paid forward in an additional payment made every year. That way, it speaks to what I think is ultimately contemplated, is that this is going to be collected by the Department of Revenue, and it does it immediately. And it also speaks to the fact that there is a long enough payout that it is not as burdensome for the industry, which really is kind of what this does as well. The House Bill 159 really, when you look at it, doesn't even begin aligning the two taxes until year 4 or 5. I don't have it in front of me, but that's when you start making those catch-up payments, and there's one additional payment made every year. And I think that's maybe a way to look at a way of fixing this, is to go back to what was originally intended, but align it with a payment schedule that is currently contemplated in House Bill 159 as a possibility. And that's what we discussed when we were together. I think that the issues that we're faced with this bill is that it came out so quickly. I don't know that anybody really had enough time to really digest how it would be dealt with. I know that my first indication of it was at a Senate Revenue Committee meeting, and that's when I saw it. That being said, with what we have today, while the schedule works right now, I think it certainly needs some adjustment. Obviously, one of them is to ensure that those payments are made on the schedule that was provided, because obviously it was there for a reason, and that was to get people used to making these payments more frequently than twice a year, and then to ultimately end up on a monthly payment schedule. And certainly understand all of that. I think the biggest issue is we need to make it so that it can be administered in a fashion that achieves the goals that the bill was trying to achieve. And with that, I'll stand for any questions you may have.
Okay, questions, Representative Swinney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how do you, with future legislation, and one of my arguments with the current legislation, how do you contemplate working through, in particular, bankruptcies with the major gas producers that we have now seen? Thank you, Mr.
Sure, Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, I don't know that that's going to change much, especially for the next probably 4 years, until they start making additional payments where they're actually moving towards a payment schedule that's identical to when the severance tax is paid. You're not really changing anything today. For the next 4 years, you're not making any additional payments. You're not moving the ball forward. So the two of them will probably remain separate until that happens. We'll be filing liens, on instruction, and that's one of the things that's complicated about this as well, is who's responsible for filing the liens. And Treasurer Shell was correct. I mean, this is kind of difficult when you consider what Section 3 does to the bill. It's really kind of hard to really contemplate that. I think obviously we're going to be filing severance tax liens, and it certainly would not be a problem to file the ad valorem lien. The issue then would be, okay, are we filing on behalf of the county? Probably. I think that's how it would be done. I think it could be argued that as an instrumentality of the state that could easily happen. But it is something that is a little complicated. I will say this, the bankruptcies, one of the reasons for moving to this is so that the amount at risk over time goes down, because we know about these bankruptcies sooner, and we know when people get in trouble sooner by having these payments aligned. Like I said, this ultimately won't be resolved until 2040 under the current schedule, but I certainly have to admit that it is complex.
Further questions from the committee? From Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I guess we have to have a way to resolve this in the legislative session. And so we're going to have one more meeting, and I would hope that we could have our options developed so that we could discuss them thoroughly at our December meeting. And Josh, I look to you, and let's think about this. We could make it, we could do two different ways. One to make it work sort of like we envisioned in the bill, and then one to adopt Mr. Noble's proposal. And with respect to a bill draft, to make it work, I think as we thought it was going to work, we have to send out the notwithstanding back to section 1 and make a decision there one way or the other. I would think that the notwithstanding only applies to the monthly payments and not the entire section 1. So I propose that a bill draft be developed that way. I also think that the treasurer, and I'm sorry, I called everybody assessors, and I apologize. I do know the difference. One wants my money and one takes my money is the way I look at it. But thank you. I apologize for that. But the fact that there's no consequence because the November 11th or November date stays the same, let's make that so there is a consequence and the interest kicks in at the appropriate point. And then Mr. Treasurer Shell, help me. What did I forget? There's one more piece that you had.
The codification of section 3, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be useful to codify section 3 in a manner that is clear for our taxpayers. That would certainly be part of good governance. So that would be one proposed bill draft, I think. And then the second proposed bill draft would be to take Mr. Noble's proposal of basically collecting current amounts now, but picking up an additional month every year or amount every year, and we could get Mr. Noble and his staff to help us flesh that out, to develop a bill draft, 2 bill drafts as alternatives that we can move this forward at our next meeting. And I'm just throwing that out as a thought piece. But I think we have to do something. And Josh, I appreciate your input on that.
And Senator Ellis, go ahead, and then we'll get to Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to hear industry's thoughts on this. Obviously, they're the taxpayer. They're highly impacted by this. So whatever direction we go, I would like to hear some testimony from our industry partners.
I assume it would be at the proper time. It'll be a motion for a bill draft that we'll review at our December meeting and make sure there's public comment. And at that time, would that be your,
yes,
I
Mr.
assumed,
Chairman.
way to go, Senator Case? Okay.
So just, Mr. Chairman, just our way of scheduling, everybody knows we only put 15 minutes on this today just to get an update. But I think the 2 paths are kind of clear, and that having those 2 vehicles would allow us to have a very in-depth discussion at our December meeting. And they seem to be 2 ways to accomplish the same thing. And so anyway, I throw that out. And then when people do their public comment, they can talk about whether those are good drafts to have come forward, and then we can vote after that.
Okay. So just so the committee is aware, we did have one person request public comment, Mr. Obermuller from PA. If he wants to say anything at this time, I would invite that, and then I'll have any follow-up questions before the motion's made. So I don't know, Pete, if you do have anything at this time, jump on in.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Revenue Committee, pleasure to see you all. Pete Obermueller, President of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. I don't have extensive remarks this morning about this. I merely want to highlight a couple of things. One, I certainly don't discount the testimony earlier about the confusion surrounding the bill and all of the difficulty in making it work in this first year. But I want to highlight one important thing that Treasurer Rochelle said, which was that 5% paid two payments, one in October, one in November, and 95% paid their first half in November. I want to make sure that you heard that's 100% of taxpayers paid their taxes. So let's make sure we understand that we're not talking about that there's delinquency going on here with respect to this. And it's important for a critical reason. One of the reasons why the bill established this stretched payment plan that doesn't actually affect how much a company pays in year one or year two or year three, precisely so that we could work out these growing pains. So whether or not someone paid in October or November or just November does not limit the revenue to the state in any way. Secondly, I think it's, I want to just, I think Treasurer Shell and I just have a little bit of different view of the landscape. Treasurer Shell mentioned that the vast majority of bills went out on time. Perhaps that's true when you talk about all the bills to everyone. The reports that I get from my members is that a significant number of my members received their bills late in October and so simply couldn't pay in October for October and November. And that's totally fine. I'm not casting aspersions. The treasurer is exactly right. They had to go through a lot of work and effort to try to update their systems and get a hang of the new legislation, as did my members. So it is what it is. That's part of the growing pains. But the bills did come in October and payments were made in November, and essentially no harm, no foul. So I just wanted to make sure that the committee understood that taxes are being paid as we work out these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer other questions.
Committee, any questions for Mr. Obermueller? Representative Sweeney, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pete, do you feel that there's we should contemplate a third option in looking at this legislation fixes? Would, in your opinion, a total repeal of all of this be a third option on the table?
Mr. Obermueller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Sweeney, I appreciate that. I would imagine that most of my members would be generally pleased with the total repeal, though, to be honest, not all of my members. There is some support for eventually matching payments of ad valorem with payments of severance. That overall, I'm in the Wayback Machine now to February here, where we talked a lot about the overall goal was that match, and there's a lot of support for that goal. Where we all got hung up was dealing with the double payments, and that's what led to this bill and trying to stretch it out and make those payments one at a time, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult for me to answer, Representative Sweeney, other than to say, as you know, it's been an extremely difficult year for my members, and probably what we would prefer the most is to leave well enough alone.
So everyone, Mr. Co-Chairman is trusting me to run the meeting for a little while. He's got to step out, so we'll have to struggle along with that. Mr. Shell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify the point of my testimony. The 95% split of those that paid were, of course, those that did pay. So I was not testifying to the fact that 100% are paid of the mineral taxes. In Converse County, we're 88% paid on our first half. That's what the actual mineral tax. What we're seeing here is companies paying the mineral taxes, but not currently paying the equipment tax. So we're only 25% collected on personal property having to do with mineral extraction, but 88% on the actual minerals themselves. So just to clarify that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Any questions for Mr. Obermuller? Any questions? Mr. Obermuller, I might ask, what do you think about the conforming changes proposed in one of the bills, which would be codification of section 3, making it clear that the notwithstanding is a limited notwithstanding, not the entire section 1, and then the interest rate, making it effective on kind of matching the monthly arrearages. Would you have strong opposition to that proposal? That seems to be most of the so-called status quo.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. And I do appreciate the language that penalties and interests are called incentives to pay, but usually the way I would use that word, but I get that. With respect to your questions, Mr. Chairman, given that this was simply a report on how it's going, we've not had an opportunity to talk about any of those sorts of changes, and we'll be prepared to do so in December.
And that's my whole intention, is to tee these questions up so we can do some problem solving at the next meeting. So thank you, Mr. Obermuller. Thank you very much. Anybody else from Mr. Obermuller? Is there any other public comment? Katie, do you know of any?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Committee, you've kind of heard what's happening. I think we do have to straighten it out and get things on the table. And Mr. Noble, what do you think? You've asked Mr. Shell.
Mr. Chairman, the department will certainly work with Josh and to make sure that if he's got questions on how to change the existing bill, or what what a substitute would look like, we'll certainly help in any way we can. Make sure we have a good product for you for your December meeting.
Mr. Anderson, Josh, what are your thoughts? Is this doable?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think I understand the issue here, and happy to work with these guys to have two versions if that's the will of the committee. I do think it's important to address this regardless of what the Attorney General's office says, and make sure that this committee has their say on how this should actually work out. So, but happy to do that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you'd like, I'll make a motion to have that bill drafted for our next meeting to clarify when the payment should be made and to which entity.
Okay, and Representative Conley, it's kind of two different ideas, and I think it would encompass two different votes or two different bills. One would be to kind of take what's on the table and do three things: address the notwithstanding, implement interest, and then codify section 3. That would be one bill. The second bill would be to draft something that reflects the Department of Revenue's thinking about moving to monthly now, but having a transition period to bring in the past, or the current amount. So it's two different bills.
Mr. Chairman, so moved.
Okay. Do people agree with this motion? It's to have two bills drafted for consideration at our next meeting. Any discussion? It does not prevent anyone from coming up with other ideas either, I think, but we'd want to duly provide notice to the public that something was going to be addressed. So Representative Sweeney, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So would you contemplate, because the incentive portion, which is currently, I don't know if it's by statute or by rule, but it seems to me if you don't pay your tax, property tax and these taxes, I'm wondering what the interest rate for mineral producers on that incentive is actually at Is it 17%? Or how does that work in the case of minerals, and should we contemplate that?
Let's find out from Treasurer Shell. Is it the same rate as other taxpayers?
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, it's 18% interest. That's correct.
Thought so. Representative Sweeney, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask that we consider that. I don't know if the treasurers or the revenue department have abilities to change rates, but that's substantial penalty.
It is, Representative Sweeney, it's a substantial penalty, but recall in the bill we passed, we allowed counties to make other arrangements. And so in a way, I think it might be covered, but if we want to deal with the penalties, can we do it separate from the discussion about having two bills drafted? And I'm looking for discussion on having the two bills drafted, not seeing any. All those in favor of having two bills drafted for consideration at our next meeting?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Representative Ellis, or Senator Ellis, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we leave this topic, you know, just listening to Mr. Obermueller talk about the fact that there's, you know, if you get your notice or your tax bill late and it pushes it into another month, do we have language existing in statute, or do we need to address it now that makes that clarification that if the treasurers are late in issuing their bills, that the penalty provisions don't apply immediately? I just don't recall the details and the particulars of our tax code to make sure that our taxpayers are protected from that.
That's a very fair question, Senator Ellis. I am not sure whether our Taxpayer Bill of Rights covers that or how, but Josh, could we ask that in addition to the two tasks that we're contemplating now, that you consider looking at that, and Senator Ellis's idea that if the notice from the Treasurer's Office is delayed, that the taxpayer has a bit of a remedy there. And you could think about it either as to whether it exists in the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, whether that should be something standalone or separate, or whether we could include it in the bills that we're contemplating now. Is that something you could look into for us?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to look at that. I think there might be something in there already on that, and I don't know if Treasurer Shell or Dan Noble has more info on that, but anyway, I'd be happy to look into that.
And the idea, I think, is to bring something actionable that we could actually vote on if need be, right, Senator Ellis?
Right, Mr. Chairman, I think the treasurer has maybe an answer for us, but if that protection doesn't exist, I just want to make sure that we're being thoughtful and not imposing taxes on people when they get their bills late.
Got you. Shell, did you have, oh, I'm looking at this tiny screen and it's got Hallinan's black, but his name is under your picture, so that's throwing me off. I'm like, really? So, Treasurer Shell.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's two relevant provisions in the current statute for that. One says the standard for interest is that interest is due when the taxpayer knew or should have known that he had a tax liability due. And the other one is that failure to receive a notice does not preclude the liability that the taxpayer has. So those are the two relevant things in the law now that you would have to look at addressing. I think the statute or the legislature has been clear to not relieve somebody of their tax liability because of a failure to receive the notice, just because this time of year we hear that all the time, right? Like we hear all, with lots of taxpayers either say they didn't get notice or the notice went to the wrong address. And so that's an ongoing issue.
So Senator Ellis, I think you heard that discussion. So currently in law, your idea is not embodied anywhere. So maybe I would task you, if you want to advance that and bring it forward, to get with Josh and figure out how you can do it as an amendment to those bills that are discussed, should you decide to do so. Would that be acceptable?
Mr. Chairman, I think I see Director Noble has his hand up.
Okay, I'm flipping between two screens with tiny faces. Director Noble, thank you, Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, I will withhold my comment until after you're done with this issue. My issue is an administrative issue I just want to talk about. Failed to bring it up earlier, but finish what you're talking about with this issue, and then I'll bring my issue up.
Okay, Senator Ellis, can we call that good? You
Mr.
will.
Chairman, yeah, I just didn't know if we could direct the committee. I think we've got an answer that this would call for a bill draft of some sort. So, happy to explore and work on that with LSO, but would like that to be part of the motion, then either have it be part of one of the two bills you mentioned or a standalone bill that the committee will consider.
I'm not opposed to the standalone bill. I think it might be able to be done as an amendment to both bills, which sounds a little easier. Go ahead, Representative Conley.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm curious if Senator Ellis' concern is merely an amendment, which is very much about these very kind of specific taxes, or more in general. If it's about this category of taxes and notice, or the lack of notice, that would be an amendment. But if it is more about the failure to get notice in general regarding any taxes, that to me is a very different issue.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Ellis.
for the purposes of this discussion today, I'd like to keep it narrow to the issue that we're discussing. I think if we move forward, we should consider that a little bit more broadly. Part of it is we haven't heard concern about, delays with a taxpayer receiving notice. I think that's pretty specific to what we're receiving today. So I want to keep it on that narrow focus. But I think that the point's well taken that if, there's reason to have notice, was it our government did its job and sent out the tax bill, it's got a date and a time stamp on it, for example, versus there was a delay on the government's end. I just want to make sure that we're not holding people accountable when the delay is our fault.
And committee, remember, we're actually collecting and sending notices out on a part of uncodified statute that's in this section 3. And so I think the Treasurer Shell's point that, that's not even providing clarity to taxpayers who've become used to knowing when taxes are due on our old system, and everything's getting changed. So I think Senator Ellis's idea has some merit. I just like her to bring it kind of on the side as an amendment to those bills if that's appropriate. And let's get back to deciding on the question of moving those two bills forward. Okay. Senator Ellis, you're good? Then let's just, the motion is to have two bills drafted, and one to really kind of take what we did and improve it. The second is to look at a new system possibly proposed by the Department of Revenue. Would you all raise your hand if you're in favor? And it's just to have the bill drafted for consideration. Okay, I see, I'm gonna look at the other screen. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got 10 in favor. That would be enough. Mr. Shell, I didn't count your votes, or Mr. Noble's, but so let's have those two bills drafted. Anything else on this issue? And look forward. And Dan or Mr. Noble, you had expressed some administrative concerns. Let's hear it.
Mr. Chairman, there is one section of House Bill 159 which allows for counties to enter into an agreement with a taxpayer to stay on the old schedule.
Right.
And that, if I'm going to be doing monthly payment of ad valorem taxes, my systems are going to expect to see not only the severance tax on a report, but also the ad valorem tax on a report. It's just going to add one extra layer of complexity when I have to tell the system, oh, in this instance, ignore that, because the treasurer and the assessor are going to collect that tax after reaching an agreement with the taxpayer. And it is problematic. I would imagine that it is can be problematic for the treasurers themselves, but it is something that if we get to where we're dealing with this on a monthly payment, it is going to create one additional layer of complexity, and I just want you to be aware of that. It'll probably add some to the cost of getting this going on the Department of Revenue side.
Thank you, Mr. Noble. Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, when we work this bill, Campbell County is doing it right now with certain taxpayers. That's already happening. So how we're handling that, that's a concern. And that's a reason why I never thought we needed this bill. I always thought we could start transitioning with new operators as they came in and have those separate agreements. But so to the extent that it's happening now, that's alarming that we're having questions from our department of how are we going to do that? Because it's already happening.
So I'll just throw a couple of things out there. We did allow in the bill for these agreements between taxpayers and counties to be implemented. And I think there was a pretty broad-based commitment to try to continue that. So, Mr. Noble, I think even if the department were collecting the taxes, we're going to need to have a process whereby these agreements become known to you and the substance of them, and the payment arrangements are all known and audible. So we're going to have to figure that out, and you've got to help us to do that.
Mr. Chairman, just wanted to bring it up just so we could discuss it.
Yeah. Very fair, very fair. Any further discussion on that? Treasurer Shell, did you have any input on that? Okay, smart man. Anybody else? All right, so let's think more about what notice would look like, Mr. Noble, and what you would require, and maybe if that's something that has to be provided in the bill draft that you're going to help develop, or if that's a standalone, possibly an amendment about notice and things like that. And it's really more than notice, it's a system that has to be implemented. And I understand it's much more complicated than that. We look to your help. Okay, committee, anything else on this topic? Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. The next topic for our consideration is, we jump right into booze. So it's alcohol taxes. And Mr. Noble, you're up on alcohol taxes. And it's kind of, remember, we're ticking off all the boxes that Management Council assigned us to look at. And so is there any movement on alcohol taxes? Are we going to have a proposal? We're not going to vote on anything at this meeting, but it would be, let's have a bill draft for next meeting that does this. Those would be the things that are in order. So Mr. Noble, to you.
Mr. Chairman, Dan Noble, Director of the Department of Revenue again. I'm not sure exactly what you want to hear from me as it relates to the alcohol taxes. What I will do is give you an overview of what they're comprised of and where we stand in the region as it relates to our taxes. And I'll address each of them separately because they each have different implications. State of Wyoming collects, and actually this is from fiscal year 2020, the last year we were out there. We collected over $20 million in a combination of taxes and markup from the sale of alcohol in the state to the general fund, $20,645,000 to be exact. Of that is comprised of two components. There is an excise tax on spirits, wine, and beer. And then there is the markup, which is 17.6% of the wholesale sale of the product through the liquor warehouse, from the liquor division. The excise taxes that the state of Wyoming imposes on each product, and understand, Wyoming is a control state, meaning we're the sole wholesaler for wine and spirits in the state, but we do not control the sale of beer. Beer is currently taxed at 2 cents per gallon, and that is the lowest in the entire country. The next lowest is 6 cents per gallon, and the lowest in our region is Colorado at 8 cents per gallon. For wine, Wyoming is not the lowest, but fairly close. We're at 28 cents per gallon. In our region, we are the lowest. Next lowest is Colorado at 32 cents a gallon. And Wyoming taxes 94 cents per gallon on spirits. And we are by far the lowest in our region there. Now, that being said, you have to recognize that our tax is comprised of two components. One is on the actual excise tax itself, but the other component of it is the markup that we charge on that product. The $20 million that I quoted a minute ago is comprised of those excise taxes as well as the 17.6% markup on the sales of that product. That amount of tax and markup, if you will, has increased over the last 10 years from, I believe it was 13 million to 20 million in that given time frame. So we've increased the sale of the product a great deal, as well as the obviously inflation affects that as well. So that is how we currently tax alcohol in the state. The liquor division, and I don't know that people realize this, Wyoming is one of 17 states and a jurisdiction that actually are involved in the controlled sale of this product. Some of the controlled states that are out there actually are not only engaged at the wholesale level, but they are also engaged at the retail level. Wyoming is strictly wholesale, and we sell to private retailers. And that is something that came about as part of the repeal of prohibition in 1935. The states were given the obligation to figure out how they wanted to control the sale of alcohol under certain of the guidelines that were offered by the federal government. Wyoming chose to take on the wholesale distribution of this product to maintain, if you will, the three-tier system as it relates to those products. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that's all I have on this. If there's questions about, what it would, what it would look like if we were to try to assimilate what other states are doing around us, I have that information. I can certainly make it available to anyone if they want it. One of the things that I think probably people need to understand is that the state is not the only entity that actually taxes these products. The federal government also has an excise tax that it charges on beer, wine, and spirits. And the tax the federal government charges on beer is $18 per 31-gallon barrel. On wine, it's based on the strength of the wine, anywhere from 21 to 67 cents per bottle, 750 ml bottle. And for distilled spirits, it's $13.50 per gallon, or about $2.14 for a 750 ml bottle. So that's pretty much the tax picture as it relates to alcohol in Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Noble. And Mr. Noble, of course, we also have local sales taxes that go on top.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. That is assessed at the retail level. There is a sales tax on the sale of all of these products.
Thank you. And one more thing, Mr. Noble, when you did your regional comparisons of tax, did you do an effective tax by doing regional comparisons with our tax plus our markup? And do you have a ranking on that?
I don't have it with me, but I can certainly get it for you, Mr. Chairman. I think the biggest issue is because of the way that certain states deal with this. I'll give you an example. Idaho is a control state, just like Wyoming. Well, not just like Wyoming. They're a control state, but they also tax at retail. They are the retailer for spirits in the state of Idaho. So there's more revenue gained there, even at the retail end of it, than there is at the wholesale. So it's pretty hard to make a direct comparison from state to state because of how different they all are. Every single state in this country controls the sale of alcohol. They just choose different ways to go about doing it.
That's very fair, Mr. Noble. It's something to think about. It does strike me that because we are the wholesaler, not the retailer, that our markup seems a little bit more like a tax than perhaps the Idaho situation where they're actually doing the distribution. But very, very fair. Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Noble, If we were to consider raising alcohol taxes, do you have a preference, and both for the agency as well as the retailers, thinking about retailers, which I think you were at one point, about changing the markup, changing the excise tax for each of the three categories, or a combination?
Before you answer, Mr. Noble, I want to let people know a little housekeeping. Mr. Mosier is in the waiting room, so I think that means he's on real time with us, but I'm going to admit him. And I see other people in the waiting room. I think they're for different items, but there's a Michelle Zupa, and I wonder if that person would like to be part of this discussion. So I'm letting Mr. Mosier in, and we see the back of his head, I think. That's what happened.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Katie, thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Michelle is for public comment tomorrow, and only Mr. Mosier for this topic.
Okay, that was my guess. I've admitted Mr. Mosier, and I appreciate it. And Katie, thanks for. So we have to move here. If we don't move, we fall in the dark. Excuse us. Hooray. This is all part of this new world that we live in, you know?
Stand.
So back to welcome, Mr. Mosier. We'll take up with you in a bit. Representative Conley had asked a question of Mr. Noble, and I'm not sure if you had got it, Mr. Mosier, so I wanted you to be part of this discussion. Representative Conley, would you mind repeating your question?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. And the question to Mr. Noble was about thinking about raising alcohol taxes. And it seems to me we have two different, or maybe three different directions to go. And it would be changing the markup from 17.6 to some other figure, changing the excise tax on each of the three elements, or a combination. And so I'm curious about kind of the ease of administration and the transparency, both to the consumers, retailers, as well as your agency with those choices.
So to you, Mr. Noble.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, actually, as it relates to, and I'm going to limit my preference, if you will, to administrative issues associated with with these taxes. I'm not in favor of one or the other. I'm here to provide you with what the administrative impact would be. Quite frankly, it will not change anything other than giving notice to the suppliers that this tax is owed. As far as administration goes, it really doesn't. It doesn't matter if any one of them could be changed, and it wouldn't really create a problem for us. The thing that I will say is that, and it's something to consider, is that when you look at the markup itself, that moves with inflation. So as the product becomes more expensive, so does that if you will, markup or tax. As a $10 bottle of bourbon becomes a $20 bottle of bourbon, 17.6% of that becomes a bigger number. So that's something to consider, is the fact that it certainly will move with inflation, and that's something that those other taxes, the other excise taxes, do not move with inflation.
Okay. Any further discussion? Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe this is for Mr. Mosier or Director Noble, but I was just wondering when the last time Wyoming did change that the excise tax that we have now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to the wine and spirits. I do know that on beer, that 2 cents a gallon has not been changed since it was put in place, and I think that was in 1940, as I recall. And Mr. Mosier probably has that down to the day. I don't know. he could probably give you a good answer with that. I think it was in 1940 when that tax was put in place, and it has not been changed since then. And I do not know exactly what date, but I know that they've been on for the time that I've been here, which is 22 years.
We have had proposals to change everything. Some have got pretty far in the committee. We'll do Representative or Senator Ellis, and then after that on deck will be Representative Sweeney. And then I assume Mr. Mosier is going to want to make a direct presentation, so we'll let him do that. So, okay, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Dan, you just opened a can of worms there. Do any of the control states, instead of having a 2 cent or a 4 cent or a 6 cent per gallon that stays that way in time, do any of them charge it based on the percentage, like a sales tax that, as you mentioned, if a product's price inflates, then you're charging a percentage. So I'm just curious if any other states tackle it that way.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I think it's all over the board. There are some that strictly charge an excise tax, and I think most all of them tax it at retail as far as the sales tax goes. But I do know of one state, and I think it is Utah, that directly has a 1% tax, if you will, excise tax on wine. It's different for spirits, but they actually have a percentage excise tax on wine. Most of the states that you look at have a combination, especially control states, have a combination of a markup as well as an excise tax. And that's what makes it kind of difficult to make direct comparisons, is that they have markup. And while let's put it this way, it's money for the state's general fund, so it in effect acts as a tax. Outside of the control states, not all of them deal with this on a basis of anything other than an excise tax like we have on spirits, wine, and beer. The same thing. It is a cents per gallon type of a tax, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to compare one to the other, because they have other ways of dealing with this. A lot of them have licensure that is fairly expensive, and in licensed states they make quite a bit of money off of the sale of these licenses as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the point I'm just trying to make is, 2 cents in the 1940s is a lot different than 2 cents today. Mm-hmm. And so rather than trying to index it or, have to revisit this, which obviously we don't want to ever revisit what we impose, it would seem that if it was more percentage based rather than 2 cents and set in statute, that might be a way of achieving a little bit of just more accurately reflecting what we're trying to do with those taxes. Because at some point, why 2 cents at all then? What's the point?
Thank you, Senator Ellis. I do agree that trying to change 2 cents every 80 years is kind of onerous. So I'm just making a joke. Fair enough. We've addressed that issue with fuel taxes at different times. We found it a little bit more difficult than we thought sometimes to get the volumetric or the percentage based. But willing to take a look at that. We could have a bill drafted to that effect. Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Noble, I'm curious if we're at a point in time on cider, is there a way to distribute that different, just as we do beer? I'm getting complaints from distributors, that the beer distributors, that it's become quite quirky for their customers to work through the process with the liquor division.
Mr. Noble, I'm not sure what he's talking about. Can you help us?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure either. Representative Sweeney, I mean, they provide us the product and we sell it to the retailers. I'm not sure that where they're saying the problem lies with this. We have had supply issues with getting cider, but that actually is coming from the folks that sell it to us, not necessarily an issue with distribution of the product.
So can I try to understand, Representative Sweeney? And I have an alcohol license. So cider, and there are lots of cider products. They're very popular, especially among younger folks. So they're actually distributed by the They're called hard cider, I think, and they're distributed by the state of Wyoming, but the state of Wyoming purchases it from our local beer distributors. Is that what I'm understanding? Representative Sweeney, help me out.
No, Mr. Chairman. The retailer has to purchase it. Unlike beer, they have to purchase it from the liquor division, where beer is treated differently. And I understand the methodology because it's an alcohol-based, just like wine coolers would be considered. So, and I'm wondering if there's a different way to look at that, both on taxation and distribution, and cut out the liquor division on distributing that particular product. Because as we're aware, wine coolers have actually started being, they're no longer really wine coolers. In a lot of instances, they're more beer coolers, represented, in my opinion, as a wine cooler, but the alcohol's derived differently. So I just wondered if there's a different way to do that.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. I might use this as a segue to get Mr. Mosier on deck, and Mr. Mosier probably has some things he wants to tell us, but could he also talk about these new products? I guess they're not so new, but Mr. Mosier, I would yield to you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mike Mosier, Wyoming State Liquor Association. Before I get into my tax thing, I think I can probably help on Representative Sweeney's issue. There are a lot of products, in fact, FMBs, flavored malt beverages, are sometimes wine and spirits based instead of malt beverage based, which means they go through the liquor division. We don't have a position one way or the other on that. One of the difficulties, however, and this ties in with what Mr. Noble said earlier, is that there's a lot more money collected on product that goes through the liquor division. So my little rule of thumb is that for every $10 million that the liquor division sells to retailers, the state profits in the general fund about $1.4 million. And so if those goods are transferred to independent malt beverage wholesalers, that would be a significant, in that area, significant fiscal loss. So you'd have to figure out a way to make the state whole. Like I said, we're not for or against it. This has been a topic for over 20 years when the ciders first came out. The other question is, where do you draw the line? Is it a certain amount of proof and then the liquor division carries it, or are malt beverage wholesalers going to carry everything that says cider or flavored malt or flavored beverages? So it's a slippery slope and would take a lot of looking at, especially from the revenue standpoint. The liquor division does a whole lot of business, and if you take 10% of that business and put it in private hands, you're losing a lot of potential revenue to the state. So we'd have to sit down and figure out how that would do it without that financial hit. So that's that. Now, go ahead.
Mr. Mosier has excellent points. I just want to point out to everybody that you represent the retailers. He doesn't represent the beer distributors, who if they were here right now, they'd have probably a different idea. But thank you, Mr. Mosier. That was very good. Please continue.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, we have met with the beer wholesalers, and the discussion is going on and how that might be done. But as I mentioned, it'll be very complex. And as Mr. Chairman mentioned, members of the committee, I am Mike Mosier of the Wyoming State Liquor Association, so I represent the retail end. First of all, and Mr. Noble said just about everything that I would want to say, and I've talked about tobacco or alcohol taxes to this committee so many times, you could probably recite my testimony back to me. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. First of all, as Mr. Noble pointed out, excise taxes by nature are regressive since they're based on volume rather than ad valorem. The markup that we utilize is much more equitable, because if you buy cheap swill like I do, it's taxed less at the 17.6% as the more expensive products are. To give you an idea of the amount of collection that we collect in Wyoming off the markup and excise tax, if you look at Colorado, for example, in 2018, Colorado brought in $47 million off excise tax, which is by far the chief driver for revenue from alcohol. Wyoming almost did half that much in collections. So you're talking over 20 million in Wyoming, 47 million in Colorado in 2018, and they've got 10 times the population we do. So the system we have is rather elegant. Now, I'll mention real quick that one of the things that is important to remember is that we're talking about incredibly price-sensitive products. With alcohol, for example, the average male, Joe Sixpack, may not be able to tell you how much a loaf of bread costs or how much a carton of milk costs, but they can tell you how much a case of their favorite beer costs or their favorite pint or $7.50. And so this is one item that people do move around for and go across borders, particularly in border towns like Cheyenne. One thing on this issue, and I want to point out, and this applies to the next issue as well, is this is because, I mean, retailers primarily carry alcohol. Now, a lot of us sell food, stuff like that, but there's a lot of businesses, this is the only product we carry. And so we're looking at taxing a specific product, singling out a specific product, especially in these tough economic times. This is not a broad-based tax. With the excise tax in particular, it's a regressive tax. And so I would oppose this tax if it were on a head of lettuce or a widget. If you do look at taxation, it needs to be broad-based and fair rather than singling out specific industries for those taxes, particularly since we're talking about the liquor industry, which has been particularly hard hit during the COVID pandemic in many cases. The other thing, and like I said, I'll be brief, committee, and I'll answer any questions, but this doesn't fix anything. The numbers I have show that the state of Wyoming brought in $247,000 with the malt beverage excise tax. If you look at that tax alone, it doesn't really solve anything if you increase it. We're not talking about the state budget having problems with hundreds of thousands. We're talking about hundreds of millions. Now, if you were talking about property tax or sales tax or other taxes, they're low too. I mean, we're a low tax state. On the other hand, that being said, those taxes, along with an income tax, because ours is like really low, like it doesn't exist, those taxes are significant enough. You increase them, it does make a difference. Alcohol taxes will not make a whole lot of difference when it comes to any type of increases. And as I mentioned, singles out one particular type of business and one particular industry rather than being a broad-based tax. So if you're going to take a hit on raising taxes, I'm not sure how my board feels, but they may be okay with the idea of an increasing a tax on alcohol if it's a sales tax, because it's broad enough base it affects everybody. But singling out our specific products for specific taxation, I don't feel is fair. We already, even though the excise tax is low, and Mr. Noble's right, it has not been raised since my rookie year in lobbying, 1940. But it
Explains that.
But if we're going to take a hit, let's do it on a tax that makes a difference rather than penalizing specific consumers and specific businesses. And I thank the committee, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mosier. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm asking this through the lens of not wanting to raise revenue, but to your point of the regressive nature. Like I said, 2 cents in 1940 is a lot different than 2 cents today. And I think there's a difference between, cheap wine and really expensive wine. And I think that that's what you're kind of hitting on too a little bit is, a sales tax that's based on a percentage of the value of the product. If you're willing to spend more money on an $80 bottle of whatever versus a $10 bottle, sales tax reflects that. And so that's, I guess, my question with the excise tax is, would your association be willing to look at creating a more percentage based rather than 2 cents per gallon to 17 cents per whatever? I don't remember all the metrics, but more in the spirit of fairness and reflecting the value of the product. Would you be willing to work on something like that for us?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Senator Ellis, that tax already exists, a markup in wine and spirits, since it is ad valorem at a 17.6% rate. That doesn't occur with malt beverages. And I'm not sure how that would be implemented since they're privatized wholesalers and you can't really have them remit a markup. And I'm not sure if the money generated would be worth the additional work in the sense that with malt beverages, if you're doing a tax like that, that would be a new tax structure and a new tax burden. So I'm certainly willing to work on anything. I just don't know if this idea holds enough merit considering the amount of money you'll be bringing in and you're singling out a product. Part of the reason I like thinking that part of the reason we haven't raised our taxes on alcohol is because I do a good job. It's really not that. It just doesn't raise enough money to make it worthwhile. And looking at malt beverages is fine. I'm just not sure if it fixes anything budgetarily and whether it's worth the hit to the retailers and our consumers in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Mosier. Any other questions for Mr. Mosier? And I think, Mr. Mosier, when you made the comment that your industry might prefer a sales tax, I think you were talking about a general sales tax on all goods, not one that singled out a sales tax specific to wine, beer, or alcohol.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. To me, a fair tax is broad-based, doesn't target specific individuals or industries. And in that sense, a broad sales tax would do that. As I said, we don't have a position on it, but that's one tax that if you're going to raise prices of products for customers is across the board and would make a fairly significant contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mosier. Any other questions for Mr. Mosier? Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mosier. It's good to see you. Did I hear you correctly saying that your industry has been particularly hit during the pandemic? Because that would make the alcohol sales in Wyoming very different than what's going on in the rest of the country, where all of the data indicates that alcohol purchases have been significantly higher.
So as not one of Mr. Mosier's members, but I do hold a liquor license, Representative Conley, I think the answer to that is it's been very spotty. The COVID concerns have shut down some places that relied on in-person and restaurants, and so those may have suffered greatly. Package may be doing well, especially in certain locations. And I think you're correct, Representative Conley, that overall in this country, as we drink ourselves to death as a response to the pandemic, alcohol sales have gone up. But certainly retail establishments, there are many that are teetering and probably ready to go under. Mr. Mosier, that's my impression. Please comment.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, that's well said. Bear in mind that I represent other things than packaged liquor stores. Clubs, restaurants, and bars are all taking a hit. And about a third, approximately a third of people who sell packaged liquor also have bars and restaurants. And so that liquor store has been basically a supply or a lifeline for their survival. Also, the amount of sales are up, but people are buying cheaper product, and which happens in a bust cycle in Wyoming as well. So just because we're selling a lot doesn't mean we're making any more money. And in some cases, as Mr. Noble knows, we have some supply shortages across the country on certain products. So there's a lot of challenges. Are packaged liquor stores surviving better overall than on-premise establishments? Yeah, but there are definitely challenges with COVID, with workforce, and with the dollar amount, average dollar amount that we're selling, that still doesn't make this a walk in the park. It's just not as impacted as on-premise establishments are. Thank you.
Mr. Noble, are we selling more booze? You're muted.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, I would say yes, a lot more booze right now.
Thank you, Wyoming, for doing your part. Representative Conley, back to you. Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Mosier? I see that we've been joined by Laura Grote. I hope I've got that right. I'm not sure. I recognize you. I think you're a wholesale malt beverage distributor, if I remember right. So the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. My name is Laura Grote, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in as well as Moshe. Obviously, we've been fighting malt beverage tax probably for 40 years or more. There was a time a couple years ago when a alcohol tax and a malt beverage tax was brought to the floor. It only had maybe 6 to 8 votes in favor of raising the tax, and to make voters this change anything.
Interrupt, Ms. What I might suggest is you shut off your video and keep the microphone, and because you're breaking up a little bit on our end, and I want you to, so now try it again. Okay, that might save some bandwidth.
Okay.
Right, go ahead.
Hold on. I'm going to try. Hello, can you hear me?
Let's try it. Keep going.
Oh, okay. I was just saying that Mr. Mosier obviously has said almost everything that needs to be said, but raising taxes in a state like Wyoming doesn't raise very much money. And so that way it's always been defeated. It's either been defeated in committee or, like I said a couple of years ago, it was defeated on the House floor. It's just not a palatable tax. We would recommend, because we are a control state, we have that extra money coming in from the state, that the taxes do not get raised.
Thank you. I think we got it. You were still breaking up a bit.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Representative Connolly, though, I think has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Groot. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So you did talk about that we have had several bills over the past couple of years. Often they have gotten out of this committee, have made it to the floor and have not made it through. And in part because the raising our taxes to kind of the level of our contiguous states only raises about $6 or $8 million a year, depending on, you know, what percentage we're using and how we're doing it. But would you agree that we are in a different time than we were 2 or 3 years ago, and maybe $6 or $8 million is what we need over and over again in order to support the state in ways that we heard about first thing this morning, so that we don't have to endure the kinds of cuts that were put forward in the governor's budget?
Thank you, Representative Connolly. Ms. Groot, you're welcome to comment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly. Yeah, we are in a different time. Obviously, we're in a cycle in our state, but it still doesn't raise enough money. And like Mr. Mosier said, it's regressive. It's not broad-based. So is it really a fair tax? I mean, you guys are going to be looking at fuel tax, which is pretty substantial. That's going to raise prices for people. I would just say that it's just not going to be palatable. I really doubt it would pass the legislature. So it kind of makes it a tax that's not going to work.
Thank you for your comments. Representative Connolly's got it.
Just to follow up, because you mentioned the notion of it being regressive. And so it would seem to me, and I understand that you don't want to raise these taxes at all, but that changing the markup and so would be the way that would make it less regressive, because that one there would impact the value of the cost of the liquor that you purchased.
And then Representative Connolly, that would affect wine and beer. I'm sorry, wine and spirits, but it would not affect beer. So that might be
Mr. Chairman, to tell you the truth, our 2 cents on that gallon of beer, I'd almost be willing to get rid of it, much less, you know, that might be an exchange going on, because at this point, I would imagine it costs more to administer that than the value that we get from that particular tax.
Understand. Ms. Grote, you'd be welcome to comment.
I don't really have a comment.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions? Any other questions? So is there any other testimony on this? I don't believe so. Committee, what's your thinking? You want to put anything together? You want to make a proposal for the December meeting? I see, I'm looking for a hand up that has a proposal. Representative Connolly, why are you waiting?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, let's put the issue on our docket for our last meeting. I think that we have addressed it over the years. It is not the time to take it off of the table. It has merit. We understand. And I just pulled up again some of the latest data. We have the absolute lowest kind of alcohol taxes in the nation. So I would like to move that we consider a bill.
I'm not going to let you get away with that, though. We do not have the lowest alcohol taxes when you consider the markup. And there was probably room to measure, but just comparing the taxes to the taxes is not an appropriate comparison, because we make 17.5%, which is substantial on the markup. I mean, please, let's just be fair about how much the state of Wyoming takes in on liquor taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let's bring that.
I have a bar and a restaurant. Thankfully, leased to someone else. People need to know that. I will have a conflict on the bill, but it is important that we understand when we talk about how low our taxes are, that we actually distribute and make money on this stuff. So back to you, Representative Conley. Please make the proposal.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let's bring all of that information to the table next time. But to do that, we need a draft bill. And so I would make a motion that we have a draft bill, and actually let's have two of them so that we can compare them. One of them which raises our markup by 20%, and one that we can even go back to the 2017 HB 166 that raised our excise taxes. So we're not reinventing the wheel here for LSO staff. Those bills already exist out there. They're already ones that have been vetted to some extent, but we could look at the difference between raising markup and then raising an excise tax.
Fair enough, Representative Conley. Let's do them separately, though. Is there any other support for raising a bill or raise the markup?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for the bringer of the motion.
Go ahead, Senator Ellis.
Thank you. If we're discussing the increasing what we collect off the markup, is there any way to weave into that a discussion of getting rid of these excise taxes in general? I mean, I'm tired of doing things the same old way. It just seems kind of goofy that we are still beholden to this 2 cent per gallon on beer, which we haven't changed since the 40s. It's like, can we just do away with that then if we're not ever going to be serious about changing it? And then kind of fold that trade-off into what you're trying to achieve with maybe looking at other ways where we collect revenue off alcohol sales. I'm just curious if you'd be willing to entertain something like that. Just curious.
Representative Conley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The markup does not impact beer sales. And so, of course, we could have another line in there. We could just call it alcohol taxation, and we could get rid of the excise tax on beer if we wanted to. I mean, that could be, they would both have the same name, I think, alcohol taxation, but there's two different ways to go about doing it. And so looking at each of those ways distinctly makes sense to me. And we could absolutely take a look at either indexing excise taxes or just getting rid of them.
So let's not get too complicated. I'm thinking of two bills, one with the markup and one on excise taxes. But certainly I think Senator Ellis has a point. We could offset one with the other or put them together in one bill. And since we're in the interim committee and we're not in the session, we can accommodate the bill title to put things together at our next meeting. So Josh, I think the direction is to, in figuring out the markup, figure out how much markup offsets all our excise taxes. And then we may have variations on that. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So Representative Sweeney, we're kind of talking about the first concept, which is the markup right now. So let's go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the markup, 20% is another 3.5% according to my math. I would defer to Director Noble. So that would take us up to 21% markup, which I no longer believe. I'm willing to look at, an increase in the markup, but not, I think that will put our border retailers at a severe disadvantage, and such as Cheyenne in particular. So are you willing to back off the 20% in the proposal?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. That figure was just a placeholder for going forward. Make it 10%.
Go ahead, Representative Conley. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So,
Sorry.
I think it's just a blank spot is the way it's drafted, and we could have a table with the amounts of money that go in there. But I do think that Senator Ellis's point about we could probably get rid of excise taxes and compensate with the markup for some things, maybe everything. Mr. Co-Chair.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, if this bill draft is assembled, could we also have LSO do the comparison to neighboring states? I know we have more of a closed market, but yeah, to make sure our equity in our surrounding states. I don't think people are going to do cross-border sales for alcohol as much as they do for cigarettes or fireworks, but it would be nice to know what surrounding states are charging.
So fair enough. And while you were at, I think Mr. Noble presented some of that. And so he'd be able to supply that information. I think that's good. So everybody, are we good on this? Representative Blackburn. I'm trying to move towards a straw poll on the markup. Go ahead, Representative Blackburn.
I'm just kind of lost right now, Mr. Chairman. Do we have a second, or I'm really enjoying this discussion, but.
Senator Ellis, I took you as a second. So I think, so yes, it's just a motion to have a bill drafted for the next meeting. Truthfully, the bill's already drafted. This is not a heavy lift. A little bit more about the comparisons with other states and what would be needed to offset the other excise taxes. Those are nuances, but I think this is not a big lift for our staff. Representative Sweeney, trying to move this forward.
My comments on the excise tax, I would not be in favor of eliminating the excise tax on beer. Even though it's not, I agree, it's not that big of a money maker, but there's got to be a little bit of fairness between the products of somewhat. So
it's fair enough, Representative Sweeney. It's not something that's necessarily integral to the bill draft. We can put all these pieces together as we see fit at the next meeting. I don't know if we need to argue them now. Senator Ellis.
Just to clarify, Mr. Chairman, I did not provide a second. It was more if Representative Connolly was willing to kind of modify her motion. I was just kind of curious to know that, maybe would provide a second if that were the case, but I just want the record to reflect I did not, there was no second on my end.
Thank you very much, Senator Ellis. That's important that you do that. Will anybody give a second? I got a second from the co-chair. I can always count on him. And there were more seconds. There were thirds of seconds. So the question is, shall we have a bill drafted on to increase the markup with various steps to be filled in later, and possibly look at offsetting excise taxes with that, and to have some information about surrounding states. All those in favor, please raise your hand so I can see them. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll be 7. Opposed? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 opposed. So that motion is carried to have a bill draft for the next meeting. Is there anything about excise taxes? Does anybody want to address a bill draft about excise tax? Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to be transparent with the committee that I am interested in the offset of how do we get rid of one, but maybe look at compensating through another. I just want to be clear with the committee that that was my reason for voting aye, just to see if we can achieve that through a bill draft.
Thank you, Senator Ellis. Is there anybody, Representative Conley? Well, let's go to Roscoe. We haven't heard him. We'll come back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just thinking, we are in different times, and we just need to keep up with the times. And 1940 was a long time ago.
Representative Roscoe, can you back up just a little bit from your microphone? You are like coming in loud and clear in a big way in this room. I don't know how you are for our folks at home, but try that, okay?
Is that any better, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry. I just think we should just keep up with the times, and we should at least look at changing the excise tax from a monetary amount to a percentage. So not 2 cents, but a certain percentage. And we could, I think, at the same time, we could couple it with the markup bill as well. But I think we should have that excise tax change to a percentage or something that would keep up with the times on our docket coming up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's think out loud. Senator, Representative, Co-Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Maybe a question for Mr. Noble, because there is some form of administrative cost to the state government, even when it comes to beer. And I don't know if he wants to weigh in on what that might be, but if there was a number we could come up with of, tracking and sales and whatever does get to the liquor division when it comes to solely beer. I do think that's, as a function of state government, to monitor and make sure, the tax is being collected, there is a cost, and that should be funded through, the taxation. So I'd be interested if this bill moves forward on, playing with that tax, what the administrative cost is to the state, and that should be covered, in my opinion. I don't know if Mr. Noble would know a number off the top of his head.
Mr. Noble, let you reflect on that.
Mr. Chairman, not a direct cost associated with it. There's not a huge amount of people reporting because it's at the wholesale level in the state. But it's really just a form that we receive from the wholesalers today. Obviously, you'd have to alter the form in order to reflect a percentage versus an actual amount per gallon type thing. But it is something, it's administratively doable. It's not something we obviously do it today with sales tax, so it isn't something that couldn't be done. It's not terribly expensive to administer. Right now, the 2 cents per gallon represents on an annual basis about $275,000 a year. That's what is generated by that tax. But as far as administration goes, I don't know that it would be any different to use a percentage than it is on a cents per gallon, but it is something that's doable for sure.
Okay. So Representative Roscoe, was that a formal motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. If it needs to be, if we can't combine it with the first bill that we were just talking about.
So I think it needs to be a separate bill on the excise taxes. And if we can combine at the next meeting, it'll be within our purview. I'm just trying to keep it separated.
Okay. Thank you. Then I do propose a bill that would change the excise tax to a percentage.
And then we could play with that percentage, I assume. And are you talking about not just beer, although the discussion has been about beer, but all of the spirits have an excise tax, right, Mr. Noble?
Mr. Chairman, they do all have an excise tax, yes.
So it'd be all categories, wine, beer, and spirits. And then we could try to make them percentage-wise and then move from there. We still haven't got a second, but Mr. Noble, we'll go to you. I know you can't give a second.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm not here to second it. I just wanted to clarify one issue. When you're looking at the wine and spirits categories, there is that additional markup, which is based on a percentage of the wholesale cost of the product. So it has both the excise tax, which is 94 cents per spirit gallon on spirits. In addition to that, there is a 17.6% markup on that product as well. That goes to the general fund.
But as I understand the motion on the table, it's to convert all the excise taxes that are volumetric based to percentage of price based. Is that correct, Representative Ross?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is correct.
Discussion. Josh, can you think of how that would work? Then I'll go back to Representative Conley in your bill drafting.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I don't see any issues. Once we get into it, but I think we'll be able to figure it out, Mr. Chairman.
You'll be the best. Thank you. Representative Conley, comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just encourage the committee to vote aye so that we have two different methods to look at. Whether or not we go with either of them will be up to the committee, but this gives us two different methods to look at for our next meeting.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Conley. I'm not seeing any other discussion. I'm going to put it to the vote. Would all those in favor of the bill draft as proposed, please raise your hand so I can see it. I've got Conley, Roscoe, Dayton, Zawana, sir. I'm in there and Sweeney's in there. So I got to count again. They're popping up like crazy. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got you, Representative Sweeney. 5, 6, 7. And opposed. Let's have opposed. I've got Larson, Hallinan, Western, Driscoll, Ellis, Blackburn. I've got 6 to 7. Did I miss one?
Bateman voted no.
Bateman voted no. It fails. It's a tie vote. And you have a fair comment. And why is the chairman voting if he's got a conflict on alcohol bills? I figured that in both these instances, they're not in my, they go against my inherent interest. So I was voting for him to move them forward. Probably have to do a conflict later, but anyway, that one failed. Is there any other proposal? Is there any other proposal? Okay, I'm going to turn this meeting back over to our co-chairman, and he can handle cigarettes because I have to go get a drink.
No further comments on alcohol, correct, committee? Representative Sweeney, another alcohol motion or comment?
I would move, could we look at a draft bill on increasing the tax on the excise tax on beer?
Got a second?
If you have a second, we can go through. I guess we'll chalk it up to Roscoe. You have a second. Do you want to further extrapolate your motion, or you just want me to have the bill drafted increase or decrease?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say it'd be an increase, being that hasn't been touched since 1940, and to what degree we can just use the current amount as a placeholder, and then it'd be up to the committee. And I would just hold it to beer.
No specific number you want to throw out? I'll just leave it as an X, and we can have a chart that says what it might raise per cent. Representative Connolly is going to jump in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just plugged 2 cents into the inflation calculator from 1940 until right now. And 2 cents in 1940 is 37 cents today.
Is that the number you want to get drafted, or Representative Sweeney?
I was thinking if we could double the current number to 4 cents versus 37, I think that would be a little more palatable.
Is that okay with the second, Representative Roscoe, to draft it?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it is.
Okay. Discussion on the bill draft committee. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of having a bill drafted the next meeting to increase the tax on beer through the sales tax, apparently, please raise your hand. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in favor. All opposed? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 opposed. That also fails. All right. Any other thing further on beer?
Now it's starting to feel like the old revenue committee.
Or alcohol? Senator Bateman, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. I was going to bring it up after the vote on the first bill proposal. My count, I thought, was a little bit different. It looked to me like it was a tie, but the chairman called it as it passed. So I was curious what the count was on that first vote that passed.
I don't think you were even here.
You mean the one just 3 minutes ago on the first bill, Senator Bateman?
Yes, the very first one we voted on.
Senator Bateman, Mr. Co-Chairman, do you mean the bill about dealing with the markup? Is that what you're referring to?
Representative Connolly's motion.
Yes, we can redo that if you think there was a mistake. It would be up to the.
Sure, I can show. I had 8 to 5, and it's on record, so I don't think it's. I can certainly ask again. If you all remember the vote we took 5 minutes ago on Representative Connolly's motion, I think that I seconded in the end on the markup. If you just raise your hands one more time.
Or we could review the tape.
Either way.
This is simple.
Sure. Just raise your hands one more time. Those of you who voted for a bill draft at some level to talk about the markup on the first bill, just to get a sense. I think both Senator Baldwin and Representative Ellis were in favor, along with Connolly, Roscoe, Driscoll, Selman, Sweeney, Case, and I. So
how many is that?
8, I hope. And so I think we're just looking at the excise or the markup, and I don't think a number is proposed. So hopefully no one chalks it down as we've drafted a revenue raising bill. It's a bill to look at the current markup and see what it should be.
Mr.
All right.
Chairman,
Yes, Senator Ellis.
just to clarify, with the potential look at eliminating excise tax entirely.
Totally.
Completely.
That motion.
Yeah, I just want to make sure the record states that it wasn't an automatic, we're looking at taxation increase. We could totally be cutting out excise taxes on that one. All right, so let's move on from alcohol to tobacco. Another fascinating subject. I think Mr. Mosier, you're staying. Mr. Noble, maybe you, unless Mr. Anderson wants to just do a quick review. I know we've had several bills trying to raise the tobacco tax. Maybe just to refresh the committee, we passed several nicotine-related bills trying to standardize the equity between vaping products and standard nicotine products this last year, as well as a 21-year-old age bill. Perhaps a quick update on any concerns or aspects of those bills once they got put into practice. They're working, at least from a taxation revenue standpoint at the department, and an update there, and we'll just kind of let the discussion flow from there if that works.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dan Noble, Director of the Department of Revenue again. Probably ought to talk a little bit about the rates that are charged currently on tobacco products. Cigarettes has been in place, I think, since around 2002. It's 60 cents per package of 20 cigarettes. That puts Wyoming, when you look at how we compare to other states in the union, at number 43. We're 43rd lowest in the country, and the number 1 is District of Columbia at $4.98. So there's quite a disparity between jurisdictions on the tax that is collected. Cigarette tax is a tax that is shared with local government. 15% of the tax is provided to local government based on where the sale occurs, the wholesale sale occurs to the retailers, and the remainder of it, the remaining 85%, goes to the state's general fund. In fiscal year 2020, and these numbers have been coming down, by the way. In 2020, 13,325,000 was distributed to the state's general fund, and 2,349,350,000 was distributed to local governments. On other tobacco products, there's 2 different ways that is collected. There's 20% of the wholesale price, or if it is sold at retail, it's 10% of the retail price. And moist snuff has a separate carve out. It is based on 60 cents per ounce of product, and anything over 1 ounce is its proportionate share of that 60 cents. OTP products are all distributed to the state general fund. Vaping products recently became taxable, and they're taxed at 15% of the wholesale price, or if it's found at retail, 7.5%. All goes to the general fund. We have just, I believe, completed the first quarter's reporting. Don't actually have the amount of revenue on that at this point, but as soon as that's available, I'll get it to you to give you an idea as to what kind of revenue is being collected on vaping products at this point. That's basically what we do with tobacco products. The OTP generates a little over, $5.5 million to the general fund on an annual basis. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions.
So the OTP, that doesn't include the vaping products, or do we have any preliminary numbers since we equalized those products on what the revenue increase is? Is it meeting what we projected?
Mr. Chairman, we haven't had enough data to actually provide that. I think we just got the first reports in and I haven't heard what the numbers are yet. As soon as those are available, I will get them to you.
Committee, any broad questions on tobacco taxation in the state of Wyoming? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Noble, do you believe that part of the problem, I know in the packet we did get information concerning the tribal governments, and do you think part of the disparity might be that we're not collecting a lot of revenue off the reservation sales, if any? Do you think that's part of the disparity?
Mr. Noble, feel free to comment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm curious as to what you mean by disparity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned we're 43rd or 48th in the taxation revenues. So I was just curious, in your opinion, if that's part of that disparity.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, we're 43rd in the rate that we charge for cigarettes. In other words, 60 cents per pack of 20 is 43rd in the nation as it relates to how much tax that we're actually collecting. Okay, the revenue itself is something that obviously is based on obviously the number of smokers in the state, that sort of thing, and how much they smoke. So that's really what I was quoting you was what 60 cents per pack represents across the nation, not necessarily what that meant in revenue.
And since Representative Sweeney brought it up, I think you all know we've had an ongoing effort with the tribes on tobacco tax equalization, and we had a report that we statutorily had to be given to us, which was turned in. I think you all got a copy here 2 weeks ago. We have Emily Soley from the governor's office here to maybe give a cursory overview of that report. And then if there are any questions as part of what Management Council assigned for this committee to look at, included just general updates on that tobacco tax equivalence from the tribes. So welcome, Ms. Soley. And if you have any comments for the committee or maybe just the cursory update of where we are right now.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Chairman Zwanitzer and members of the committee. My name is Emily Soley. I am special counsel to the governor's office. I'm also his policy advisor as to tribal and state relations. As Chairman Zwanitzer noted, we did submit a written report to this committee regarding the status of negotiations between our office and each tribal business council to set a uniform tax rate across the state, with the idea being that the state tax rate would be imposed on all tobacco sales within the Wind River Reservation, regardless of tribal membership status, as opposed to how it works now, which is essentially that individual retailers, and Director Noble will be able to speak better to this than I will be able to, but the Department of Revenue presently enters into agreements each year with individual tribal retailers. Through those agreements, tribal retailers do pay state tax on tobacco sales on the reservation based on a portion of sales which those retailers estimate are going to non-tribal members. So retailers are currently paying state tax on tobacco sales. The act which directed our office, the Tobacco Equivalence Act, which directed our office to enter into these negotiations with tribes, sought a uniform tax rate for all sales on the Wind River Reservation and not just those to non-tribal members. As I think you can tell from the report, I guess I would classify negotiations at this point as stalled. Our liaisons began discussing this issue with each of the business councils last year. Our office and the governor personally has been engaged in these discussions with the chairman of each tribe, as well as with Department of Revenue, legal counsel for each tribe, and the Attorney General's office throughout the year. We did provide, at the request of the tribes, a written proposal from the state regarding what we feel to be a fair, what a fair tax compact would look like. And essentially what that proposal was that upon the tribe's joint agreement to apply the state tobacco taxation rate to sales on the Wind River Reservation, the Department of Revenue would administer that tax and would remit the revenue from that tax to each tribal government. A portion would be remitted to local government, to Fremont County, in approximately the same amount that they currently get based on how Department of Revenue collects tax now. And so that written proposal was sent to each of the tribes in June. We have not received a response from either of the tribes on that proposal. We've been told that it remains under legal review. The governor brings it up in each meeting he has with business councils, but we really have not gotten a formal response, so I can't speak to each of the tribes' position on that proposal. I will say that under the structure that was included in the state's term sheet to the tribe, the result we would estimate would be generating revenue in the amount of about $420,000 annually based on all sales from all tribal retailers. And so that, I want to be clear, that would not be $420,000 to each tribe. That would be total, and we would need to work out how that would be distributed to each tribe. So that's the amount of money that is kind of on the table for the tribes.
Senator Case has a question.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And so thank you very much for that. The reservation, of course, is my district. At least my district encompasses everywhere that people live on the Wind River Reservation, including all the retail outlets, sell cigarettes, the casinos, and where the people live. I have a suggestion about the rhetoric, and working on this in the Tribal Relations Committee. It's always a rough approach to the tribes to ask them to impose the state taxes or impose state laws on the reservation. I think we would get farther if we asked them to join with us to jointly impose taxes that are matching and keep the rhetoric at the level. And when we were working on this proposal, we even talked about different colored tax stamps. They'd all be stamped by the same place in the same limit, but cigarettes sold on a reservation might have a blue stamp. Those sold off the reservation might have a different stamp, and that it gives the impression that we are two sovereign entities imposing a tax that happens to be the same, and the compact is that the taxes are the same, and we agree to do that. And that just sounds so much better to these entities that are very concerned about their sovereignty. And when we ask them, please, we want you to put in the state cigarette tax and you can keep the money, that doesn't sound nearly as desirable as we want you to jointly administer a cigarette tax program where you get a kind of tax and keep and we'll tax and keep, and we'll do it at the same level. That just sounds better. That's my suggestion.
Wouldn't you agree?
Wouldn't you agree,
Ms.
Solai?
Chairman Zonitzer and Co-Chair Case, I appreciate those comments, so thank you for them. And certainly any time our office is in discussions with the tribes about any matter, we certainly attempt to be respectful of each tribe's sovereignty and the fact that ultimately this is an exercise of their sovereignty, whether or not to enter into an agreement like this with the state. I do want to be clear that the proposal to the tribe was for the tribes to impose their own tribal tax, and that tribal tax would be administered by the Department of Revenue. So when you're referencing the state tax stamp versus tribal tax stamp, that is a discussion that we've had, that the department would have a separate tax stamp specifically for sales made on the reservation. But thank you for those comments.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from Ms. Solai? Seeing none at this time, Mr. Noble, any weigh-in from the Department of Revenue on your take of how it's going? Similar to Ms. Solai, I assume?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. We actually worked together on putting this proposal together. The idea of having a separate stamp was discussed as well. And I think that I'm hoping that we can gain some traction, because quite frankly, the way this is currently administered is pretty much a guess. As it stands right now, we ask each of the retailers, okay, how many non-tribal sales do you make? And quite frankly, it's probably an estimate. The other aspect of that is that tax is actually paid by the retailer at that point. And that's kind of important to understand, is that an unstamped product is sold, and then that tax is collected from the retailer and not from the consumer. So it's a little problematic on a couple of levels, but it's also something that we've done this for a number of years. As a matter of fact, we've done this ever since I've been with revenue, and it was really hopeful that that we could come up with something that would work for the tribes. Certainly understanding the sensitivity as it relates to their maintaining their sovereignty, and I think it was in the report that I saw from Emily, I think that was paramount in the discussion, was trying to maintain some level of sovereignty for the tribes themselves.
Okay. Seeing no further questions from Mr. Noble or Ms. Solai, wanted to quickly say thank you, Ms. Solai, for joining us today and waiting around, and keep up the good work in the executive branch and working with our Tribal Relations Committee as well.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Case.
On the issue of taxation of cigarettes, it would be in order to come up with something to go for the next meeting. I know that there has been some concerns about the vaping tax that was implemented. We have one more meeting, so if people could bring individual bills, of course, but if you wanted to try to move something forward, this would be the time. But we do have a lot on our agenda.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about anything else on the reservation tobacco issue, and then
I didn't mean to get ahead. I apologize.
I know it's lunchtime coming up. Anything else on the tribal compact? Representative Sweeney, you do? Go ahead.
I just noticed Mark Larson was on screen, and I referencing his letter, perhaps he had something on tribal. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, Mr. Larson, welcome. We're currently talking specifically about the tax equivalents on the reservation and our ongoing negotiations. Did you have any comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Mark Larson with the Wyoming Petroleum Marketers Association. I really appreciate the committee, number one, passing the bill in 2019 that forwarded the discussions. It's a national issue. We are the retailers that are competing with the reservation facilities, and we have never said that we want to tax tribal entities. We only believe that there's a significant tax avoidance issue going on with sales to non-Native Americans, and that's to the detriment of the state tax policy or state tax coffers, as well as the surrounding retailers. I fully respect the tribe's sovereignty, but there is precedent for 12 different states have implemented a wholesale distribution taxing regimen, and then worked out a compact with the tribes. Senator Case, I wholly respect the way that approaching the tribes is important, but with all due respect, Mr. Noble and the department have been working on this issue since 2011, or yes, 2011, when the cigarette tax agreement, which is he mentioned is not audited. There's no specificity at all other than it's voluntary with the reservations. At the risk of getting into legal area that I certainly do not know, but certainly Senator Ellis knows all of it. There's 5 different Supreme Court cases that have said that the states have the ability, indeed the obligation, to make sure that non-Native Americans are paying their first taxes on the tax of tobacco products or cigarettes. I might also point out that OTPs that are also being sold and vaping that are also being sold on the reservation, there is no agreement at this point. So those are completely untaxed. What the petroleum marketers are recommending is that for the time the Attorney General's office works with the tribe and coming up with a compact, it incidentally is very similar to the concept of the gasoline compact that was exacted a few years ago and seems to be working very well to the benefit of the tribe and surrounding businesses, is that we move forward with a wholesale distribution requirement that all products that are sold in the state are taxed, and including OTPs and cigarettes. We understand that there may be some pushback from those that think that we haven't gone to the level necessary to enjoin the tribes in the discussion, but I would submit that since 2011 we have. This is not a new issue to states. This is not a new issue to states with reservations. So our request to the committee is to come up with a simple bill that simply says that all tobacco products will be taxed at wholesale, and then work with the tribes indeed to come up with a compact similar to the gas tax that benefits them. Obviously, there's going to be some substantial gain for the tribes in the revenue that's generated back to them, just like on the gas compact. And we're hoping that the tribes would then move forward a little bit with a little bit more sense of urgency, recognizing our only goal is leveling the playing field and making sure that non-Native Americans are not benefiting from a tax avoidance structure that's being enabled by this policy. I'll stand for questions.
I have one quick one for you, Mr. Larson, with this idea of wholesale. You work in multiple states. I also believe in Colorado, and they have 2 tribes, at least, if I'm not mistaken. In Colorado, is that how the issue works between the sovereign tribes and the state government, or any kind of comparison you could give quickly on how Colorado runs this issue?
Mr. Chairman, in a former life, I was a representative in Colorado in the state legislature and represented both of the tribes in the legislature. To my knowledge, there still has not been a compact exacted with the tribes on the excise tax. Of course, all tribes pay the federal tax, but to my knowledge, there has not been anything there. But there are 12 states that have exacted the tax, and then I do not know any data whether those 12 states have come up with compacts. Our goal, again, Mr. Chairman, is not to exact a pound of flesh on the reservation retailers. We want to level the playing field and then give them back any of the tax that is collected on the sales of those tobacco products. I hope that answered your question.
Yes. Further questions from Mr. Larson from the petroleum marketers? Seeing none at this time. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, committee.
And then, so committee, we have the general topic of tobacco taxation. Certainly there have been attempts in the past to raise the taxation on nicotine to at least comparable values to 3 of our neighboring states. I know South Dakota and Montana have much higher tax rates than Wyoming does. Historically, me personally has been concerned about equity and making sure we don't have kind of this perverse public policy incentive for people to drive into our state to purchase large amounts of nicotine to drive back to, let's say, South Dakota or Montana. We have had several bills in the past about raising the taxation rate to an inflationary level, which I supported because I do not believe we've raised the taxation of tobacco, of nicotine since 2003. But Mr. Noble could correct me. And last I remember that if we did just do an inflationary index to what we were getting 17 years ago, it was about $19 million. Mr. Noble, is that still relatively correct I want to make sure I didn't say anything wrong.
Mr. Chairman, actually, revenue is actually down, and that's obviously an issue of less sales of the product, not necessarily, it has nothing to do with inflation. I know that when a bill was passed or was presented a while back, I think they wanted to keep up with inflation. They were proposing 90 cents, I believe, at that point. But it's kind of hard to say what it would look like here because the actual use of this product is going down instead of up.
So committee, this was on our topics for management council to look at all sources of taxation and revenue. So if anyone would like to make a pitch for a bill at our December meeting to go one way or the other with the nicotine tax, certainly would entertain that motion at this time. Representative Hallinan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think we should make the cigarette tax equal the amount of inflation that we've had since 2003. 60 cents was the amount that was set back then. And if we modify that tax to equal the amount of inflation, it would be another 24 cents. That would be raising it by 24 cents to 84 cents per pack of 20. So I would move that we would approve and make a bill available at our next meeting that would do just that, that would raise the tax on cigarettes from 60 cents to 84 cents per pack. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Hallinan. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Representative Connolly. Any discussion, committee? Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm just curious with Representative Hallinan's motion, often these bills include kind of a comparable increase for other tobacco products, the OTPs. And so I'm curious if that is kind of part of the motion as well.
Representative Hallinan, would that be okay as part of your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it would. I appreciate Senator or Representative Connolly for bringing that up. I think we should bring all of these tobacco products up to the current rate of inflation. So that would be the case. Yes, I would be in favor of raising the other tobacco products by a similar 24 or a similar 40% increase.
And Josh, I know you're still on. That's assumedly agreeable and achievable.
Yep, no problem, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Noble next in case we need to fine tune that request.
Mr. Chairman, other tobacco products are kind of bifurcated. You have all other tobacco products, which is taxed as a percentage of the wholesale price at 20% of the wholesale price. So it would follow inflation anyway. And then you have moist snuff tobacco, which is taxed at a cents per ounce, which is like the other excise taxes that would probably need to be adjusted for inflation. So part of OTP would already follows inflation and part of it does not. So that's something you'd probably want to look at.
And I would trust that we could finagle that correctly in legislation to keep it close to as comparable as possible, similar to what we did with vaping products this last year to try to equalize the taxation. Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's basically my question is, are we adding a tax on vaping products at the wholesale level, which I think it's too new to be doing. And I do want, before we leave the total subject, not on the bill, but I did have a question for Director Noble on vaping products. I had talked to him and I hadn't gotten any information back yet on a particular subject on vaping. But
Let me clarify your question real fast, or what you're asking, Representative Sweeney. If we did do the inflationary measure on nicotine products, your suggestion would be not to have that equal inflationary measure on vape products to be at the nicotine product level? Would you like us to, if the bill draft motion passes, I assume we could break that out and have that conversation as well, if it should remain equilateral or if it is too new and any new scientific information comes out? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that what I assume you're asking, Representative Sweeney?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think we taxed vaping products based on the nicotine content per volume specifically, but I may be wrong on that because I was trying to get to that, but we went for the wholesale, not necessarily in the volume versus nicotine, if I'm correct on that. So maybe if I could get a clarification on that first.
So I'll just say from my understanding, we tried to make it as equal as possible. Director Noble, Representative Sweeney's assertions correct in your mind?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, we tax today, based on the way the statute was written, we tax it at 15% of the wholesale price, or if it is sold at retail without being taxed, it is at 7.5% of the retail price. And it would already follow inflation. So as the product became more expensive, the actual tax on it would go up as well.
Okay, so let me get to this motion, if that's okay with Representative Sweeney, and then if you have additional questions on tobacco taxation for the director, we can talk about that in just a second. Is there any other further discussion or question on this motion? Representative Hallinan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this inflationary impact should only be in respect to the cigarettes and not the vaping products. I think that's a separate issue and should be dealt with separately. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and that was the motion as I understood it. So I think that would keep Representative Sweeney happy. And I'm going to look to see if Representative Connolly is nodding that she's okay with that motion as just nicotine products.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would include moist snuff. That would be another section, but no, we're not touching the vaping issue.
Okay. So back to the motion. Any further questions or discussion from committee members? Seeing none at this time, all in favor of having just a bill drafted to raise the nicotine tax to an inflationary measure for 2020, please raise your hand for our next meeting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 aye votes. All those opposed, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No votes. The chair will vote yes. So we're missing 2 senators currently. I'm just guessing I know which way they would both vote. So we'll go 6-5 on that one and have a bill draft at least drafted for our next meeting. I'm pretty sure, Josh, it's a very simple bill draft. Change some numbers and present. Would that be correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. I think Ted already has a version of this drafted, so shouldn't be too hard to adjust that.
Love it when it's easy. All right, Representative Sweeney, you had another question on tobacco taxation for Director Noble?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Dan, if you remember a few weeks ago, we got, I think, got an email from one of my constituents in reference to the taxation on the wholesale level on the vape product. And I apologize, I didn't follow up with you. I know you were going to turn that over to somebody in the department, but I just was curious. And I think Representative Blackburn also had reached out on that too.
And it was around an email that all the committee members received from a woman who testified last year who was not happy with our current level of taxation. So, Mr. Noble?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know why you guys didn't get a response. I did turn it over, but I will check into it and get back to you as to what they resolve. I mean, I guess I look at it this way is if 15% is creating a problem for one, it's obviously creating that problem for all of them because we're taxing them all the same. I'm just wondering if the person's issue was that I mean, I think I recall them saying it was putting them out of business, and I'm curious as to why that would be if they're all being treated equally, or is her issue that she doesn't. Some people are not paying this tax and others are. If that's the case, then that's something we need to know about so we can deal with it. But I'll check to see what my staff has done with it, and I'll get back to you.
Representative Blackburn, did you have a question?
No, just a comment for Director that.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes people won't come forward. They just say, oh, well, that's the government, so I got to pay it. Sometimes people fear coming forward because of retribution. Who knows? At least she had enough courage to step forward and voice her opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It's great it's not great when you hear from constituents complaining, but she was very involved in the process, and it's been a rough business year for a lot of people in this state. And it's going to be a rough year for a lot of government employees and teachers in the state coming forward. So difficult times. Anything else from the Committee on Tobacco Taxation? Seeing none, I did talk to YDOT on the fuel tax, and they are okay waiting until 1:30 to present. So with that committee, let's take a recess until 1:30. Enjoy your lunch. I'd remind you to turn off your microphones and your cameras, and we'll meet back here at 1:30.
And Mr. Chairman, a new YouTube link.
And there will be a new YouTube link sent to you from Ms. Talbot at LSO.
The Zoom link will be the same, but YouTube stream will be different on the website.